Close your eyes and take a deep, gentle breath. Feel the weight of your body sink softly into the surface beneath you. With each exhale, let the tension slip away from your shoulders, from your back, from your mind. Imagine a quiet morning mist spreading across a vast, untouched land, where the sun rises slowly, brushing the landscape with a gentle golden light. Hear the whisper of winds carrying secrets from centuries past, and let yourself drift, calm and peaceful, ready to journey through time. As your mind relaxes, you begin to walk softly through a world that existed long before cities, roads, or boundaries, where the land itself tells stories older than memory, a place where rivers carve their way through valleys, and forests stretch endlessly, filled with creatures moving silently beneath the canopy. Feel the rhythm of life as it once was, simple yet profound, and allow your imagination to guide you gently, drifting into a deep, serene state, ready to explore the history of a land that would one day become America. Long before the first Europeans set their eyes upon the eastern shores of the continent, long before the bustling colonies and sprawling cities, the land we now know as America was a canvas of nature, painted in vast forests, rolling plains, towering mountains, and intricate networks of rivers and lakes. People had arrived here thousands of years before any ink was ever spilled on maps by explorers. These were the first Americans, the indigenous peoples, who crossed icy land bridges that connected continents during the last great ice age, following herds of animals and establishing themselves in a land that was both generous and demanding. Life was deeply intertwined with nature. Tribes and communities formed based on kinship, survival, and shared understanding of the environment. Knowledge of seasons, migration patterns, and natural resources was not just practical, it was sacred. They built intricate societies where oral traditions, stories, rituals, and ceremonies passed down knowledge, history, and the essence of their cultures through generations. From the icy stretches of the Arctic, where the Inuit hunted seals and navigated frozen expanses, to the temperate forests of the East, where the Iroquois Confederacy would later form a sophisticated political system, the diversity of human adaptation was staggering. In the plains, nomadic tribes followed the bison, moving with the rhythm of life itself, their lives dictated by the vast herds that provided food, clothing, and materials for shelter. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings and intricate irrigation systems, demonstrating engineering knowledge that rivaled anything in the Old World. These people were not isolated. They traded, traveled, and shared ideas over hundreds of miles, creating networks that were invisible to the casual observer, but vital to the survival and flourishing of their societies. Time itself in these early periods moved in cycles. Seasons dictated the pace of life, from planting and harvesting to hunting and gathering. Every aspect of existence, from the tools they made to the clothing they wore, reflected intimate knowledge of their environment. Stone, bone, and wood were transformed into tools and weapons with a precision born of necessity and ingenuity. Communities were bound not just by geography, but by shared belief systems, often revolving around respect for the land and the interconnectedness of all life. Their spiritual life was woven into the fabric of daily routines. Ceremonies marked the changing of seasons, the growth of children, the hunt and the harvest. Rituals were more than symbolic. They were the pulse of society, a way to anchor human life within the broader rhythms of the natural world. As centuries passed, the complexity of these societies grew. The Mississippian culture in the central and southeastern regions of North America built mound cities with plazas, temples, and ceremonial grounds, some as large as major European towns of the same period. Trade networks spanned hundreds of miles, connecting the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, exchanging shells, copper, pottery, and other goods. The knowledge and skill embedded in these cultures were profound, though largely invisible to the European eye that would later arrive. In the Pacific Northwest, tribes fished the abundant rivers and crafted massive wooden totem poles, their art telling stories of ancestry, spirits, and power. Across the continent, each culture developed unique adaptations, technologies, and social structures, proving that the Americas were far from a wilderness devoid of history. They were alive with human ingenuity, creativity, and resilience. The land itself shaped these people, and in turn, they shaped the land. Forests were carefully managed, controlled burns maintained fertile fields, and animals were hunted with sustainable methods. Rivers were routes of transport, communication, and trade. Mountains and plains were not obstacles, but markers in a vast network of life that stretched from one horizon to another. Understanding the harmony between survival and sustainability was crucial, and it is a testament to the depth of human intelligence and observation. Every corner of the continent hosted a tapestry of life, with humans playing a role as both participants and observers, respecting cycles that spanned generations. This ancient landscape, however, was about to meet a wave of change. Across the Atlantic, civilizations were rising, falling, and seeking new horizons. Stories of distant lands filled the minds of explorers, merchants, and kings alike. The stage was set for a collision of worlds, one that would transform not just the land, but the very lives of its inhabitants. Yet before that contact, it is essential to understand the world as it was, diverse, vibrant, and self-sustaining, full of rich oral histories, thriving communities, and a deep connection to the natural rhythms of life. Every tribe, every settlement, every life was a story, a testament to adaptation, resilience, and survival in a continent as vast and varied as any on Earth. It was a world where the hunt could determine life or death, yet songs and stories provided comfort and wisdom. Children learned through observation, mimicry, and participation, gradually inheriting the skills, knowledge, and values of their elders. Festivals and rituals were interwoven with the practical needs of the seasons: planting, harvesting, hunting, and gathering. Spirituality was not separate from daily life, it was inseparable from it, a lens through which people viewed the cosmos, the land, and their place within it. Nature and humanity existed in a delicate balance, each informing the other, each dependent on the careful attention of the other for survival. As the Ice Age ended, landscapes shifted, glaciers retreated, revealing fertile valleys and new waterways, inviting migration and settlement in areas previously inhospitable. Populations grew, and with growth came complexity. Tribes organized into larger confederations, created intricate governance systems, and developed specialized skills in art, architecture, agriculture, and hunting. Each region developed distinct strategies for survival, resulting in a patchwork of societies adapted to deserts, mountains, plains, forests, and coastlines. It is easy to underestimate the sophistication of these early peoples, but the evidence of their ingenuity lies in every artifact, mound, and settlement left behind, a silent testimony to a civilization deeply in tune with the land they called home. This was the world that awaited the distant whispers of sailors and adventurers crossing oceans, unknowingly approaching lands teeming with life, culture, and history. Yet, for the first Americans, life was a delicate balance of harmony, survival, and celebration, a rhythm dictated by the cycles of sun, moon, and seasons, by the migration of animals, and by the fertility of the land. It was a rhythm that had endured for millennia, shaping not only the landscapes they inhabited, but also the foundations of culture, society, and understanding that would continue to echo even as the world around them changed forever. As the centuries unfolded, the vast lands of America continued in their quiet, intricate dance of life, largely undisturbed by the distant rumblings of the Old World. Yet across the Atlantic, Europe was awakening to an era of exploration, curiosity, and ambition. Kingdoms and empires were seeking new trade routes, riches, and territories. driven by tales of distant lands, spices, gold, and the promise of expanding influence. By the late 15th century, explorers like Christopher Columbus set sail, motivated by a mixture of adventure, economic interests, and the desire to claim lands for their sovereigns. While their maps were limited, their dreams were immense, and those dreams would bring them to the shores of a continent that had thrived without their knowledge for thousands of years. When the first European ships arrived, the Americas presented both wonder and challenge. Vast forests stretched beyond sight, rivers flowed like silver veins through fertile lands, and the skies above were alive with unfamiliar birds and clouds of insects. Indigenous peoples watched these newcomers cautiously, curious but wary. Communication was difficult, and misunderstandings often arose. The Europeans were struck by the abundance of resources, the fertile soil, the immense forests, and the wealth of game, but they often failed to understand the sophisticated social structures, trade networks, and spiritual practices that governed the lives of the first Americans. The collision of two worlds, one shaped by millennia of adaptation and the other by centuries of maritime ambition, was inevitable. Early interactions varied widely across the continent. In some regions, trade flourished, as indigenous communities exchanged furs, food, and local knowledge for European goods such as metal tools, textiles, and beads. In other areas, however, tension quickly escalated into conflict, driven by competition for resources, cultural misunderstandings, and differing concepts of land ownership. The European insistence on claiming vast tracts of land often clashed with indigenous understandings of territory, stewardship, and communal use, leading to disputes that would resonate for centuries. Diseases introduced by Europeans, for which native populations had no immunity, devastated communities, dramatically altering the demographic landscape in ways that were both sudden and profound. Among the earliest European settlers were the Spanish, who ventured into the southern and southwestern regions of what is now the United States, Mexico, and Central America. Motivated by the pursuit of gold, glory, and the spread of Christianity, Spanish explorers established settlements, missions, and fortresses. Their presence introduced horses, new agricultural techniques, and European governance structures, forever changing the local cultures and economies. In the northern regions, the English and French were drawn by the prospects of trade, fishing, and territorial expansion. The French focused largely on fur trade and alliances with indigenous groups, establishing networks of forts and trading posts along major rivers and lakes, while the English began forming colonies along the eastern seaboard, seeking to build permanent settlements and communities. The English colonies developed differently than the Spanish and French ventures. While Spain was often focused on conquest and extraction, and France on trade and alliance building, the English brought with them the idea of transplanting societies, villages, farms, and towns modeled on life in England, complete with their own social hierarchies, religious practices, and systems of governance. Jamestown, founded in 1607, became the first permanent English settlement in North America, surviving through a combination of trade, adaptation, and sheer perseverance. The early settlers faced famine, disease, and conflicts with indigenous peoples, yet they gradually carved out communities that would form the seeds of future colonies. Religion played a central role in shaping many of the English settlements. Groups seeking freedom from persecution, such as the Pilgrims and Puritans, journeyed across the Atlantic, with the hope of establishing communities guided by their faith and values. Plymouth Colony, founded in 1620, became a symbol of determination, resilience, and the pursuit of religious liberty. These settlers endured harsh winters, scarcity of food, and the challenges of unfamiliar land, relying heavily on guidance and assistance from neighboring indigenous tribes, whose knowledge of local agriculture, hunting, and survival techniques proved invaluable. As these settlements expanded, the colonies began to take on distinct identities, influenced by geography, climate, and the mix of cultures present. In New England, dense forests and rocky soil encouraged smaller farms, fishing, and trade, fostering tight-knit communities focused on cooperation and religious observance. In the middle colonies, the fertile soil and navigable rivers encouraged larger farms, trade, and diverse populations, with settlers from multiple European nations coexisting, bringing different languages, traditions, and skills. The southern colonies, with their long growing seasons and vast expanses of arable land, developed plantation economies reliant on labor-intensive crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo, which ultimately led to the tragic and enduring institution of slavery. Trade networks within the colonies and with Europe became increasingly sophisticated. Ports such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia flourished as centers of commerce, connecting the New World to the Old through goods, ideas, and people. Ships carried raw materials, crops, and furs to Europe, while manufactured goods, tools, and luxury items made the return journey across the Atlantic. This constant exchange transformed the colonies economically, socially, and culturally, laying the foundations for a uniquely American identity that would later assert itself more forcefully. Yet, life in the colonies was never simple. Harsh winters, unpredictable weather, and unfamiliar diseases challenged even the most prepared settlers. Political structures evolved slowly, often in response to practical needs. Town meetings, local councils, and colonial charters provided forms of self-governance, nurturing a sense of autonomy and responsibility. Conflicts occasionally erupted, both internally among settlers with differing visions and externally with indigenous nations who sought to defend their lands and way of life. Each interaction, whether cooperative or adversarial, shaped the character of the colonies and the people who called them home. Cultural exchanges were complex and multifaceted. European settlers introduced new technologies, religious ideas, and agricultural techniques, but they also absorbed elements from indigenous communities, knowledge of local plants and animals, survival strategies, and sometimes linguistic elements. Over time, a hybrid culture emerged, shaped by necessity, curiosity, and adaptation. This blending, however, was uneven and often marred by inequity, conquest, and misunderstanding, creating a landscape of diversity, tension, and transformation that would continue to define the American story. The economic life of the colonies began to develop its own rhythm. In New England, the combination of subsistence farming, fishing, and maritime trade created a stable yet competitive environment. The middle colonies benefited from fertile soil and navigable rivers, producing grains, livestock, and lumber that could be exported and sold profitably. The southern colonies' plantation system demanded intensive labor, initially from indentured servants, and later increasingly from enslaved Africans, embedding social hierarchies and economic dependencies that would have profound consequences for centuries. Wealth, power, and opportunity were distributed unevenly, but the colonies thrived in ways that astonished both their inhabitants and European observers. Education and literacy became markers of identity and aspiration. In New England, for example, towns were expected to provide schooling for children, emphasizing reading, writing, and religious instruction. Literacy allowed individuals to engage with legal documents, religious texts, and political ideas, fostering a culture of informed participation that would later become crucial in shaping American democracy. Libraries, informal study groups, and apprenticeship programs spread knowledge, creating communities that valued learning as much as survival. This intellectual development, combined with practical skills, cultivated a sense of self-reliance, inquiry, and responsibility that distinguished the colonies from many parts of the Old World. As the 17th century progressed, the colonies were no longer isolated outposts, but part of a larger Atlantic world, connected economically, politically, and culturally. trade routes linked North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa, creating networks that exchanged not only goods, but also ideas, labor, and cultural practices. The notorious triangular trade, with its human cost, connected continents in a web of commerce that profoundly shaped societies on both sides of the ocean. European ambitions, indigenous resilience, and African forced migrations combined to create a dynamic, often turbulent environment in which the seeds of modern America were quietly taking root. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the American colonies grew in size, population, and complexity. The settlements that had once struggled to survive now expanded into thriving communities, connected by roads, rivers, and trade. The rhythm of life in the colonies became a tapestry of labor, family, community, and faith. Yet beneath the surface, change was quietly stirring. Economic prosperity, increasing literacy, and a growing sense of autonomy nurtured an environment where ideas could flourish. People began to imagine possibilities beyond mere survival, envisioning lives shaped not only by necessity but also by choice, ambition, and ideals of fairness and justice. The colonies were remarkably diverse. In New England, towns were tightly knit, often centered around the meeting house, where civic and spiritual life intertwined. Families worked hard to farm the rocky soil, but trade and fishing offered additional sustenance and income. Across the middle colonies, fertile fields produced abundant grains and livestock, supporting populations that were culturally and linguistically varied, with Dutch, German, English, and Swedish settlers coexisting, exchanging traditions, and learning from one another. The southern colonies, with their vast plantations, cultivated wealth from tobacco, rice, and indigo. Yet this prosperity came at a grave human cost. Enslaved Africans were brought in large numbers, their labor underpinning the economic engine of the South, and leaving a legacy of inequality and suffering that would endure for centuries. The growth of towns and cities brought new social dynamics. Markets buzzed with activity as merchants, artisans, and farmers interacted, exchanging goods, news, and ideas. Roads became arteries connecting settlements, while rivers remained vital for transporting goods and people. Ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston emerged as centers of commerce and culture, linking the colonies not only to each other, but also to Europe and the wider Atlantic world. Newspapers began to circulate, carrying news, opinions, and debates that shaped public consciousness. Literacy and access to information nurtured a population increasingly aware of both local and global events, fostering discussions that questioned authority, policy, and governance. Religious and philosophical ideas also shaped colonial life. While the early settlers had often fled Europe to escape persecution, they brought with them their beliefs, which in turn influenced law, education, and civic life. Yet diversity in belief systems meant that colonies were not monolithic. Quakers in Pennsylvania emphasized equality and pacifism. Puritans in Massachusetts maintained strict moral codes, and Anglicans in the South upheld hierarchical traditions. Debates over governance, rights, and responsibility began to emerge, as people considered how faith, law, and personal liberty should coexist. These discussions planted seeds of thought that would later blossom into revolutionary ideals. Trade, both domestic and international, expanded rapidly. Colonists produced raw materials, crops, and crafts, exporting them to England, Europe, and the Caribbean. Ships carried tobacco, grain, lumber, and furs across the Atlantic, returning with manufactured goods, textiles, tools, and luxury items. This commerce created wealth, social mobility, and opportunities for entrepreneurship, but it also fostered dependencies and tensions. The British government sought to regulate trade to its advantage, implementing tariffs, restrictions, and policies that would later become points of contention. Colonists, increasingly prosperous and educated, began to chafe under external control, sensing that their hard work and innovation were not fully recognized or rewarded. Life in the colonies was not without hardship. Disease, harsh winters, and agricultural challenges continued to test the resilience of settlers. Families relied on communal networks for support, while local governance evolved to meet the demands of growing populations. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, and legal codes reflected the desire for self-determination and structured society. Education remained a priority, with schools teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside religious instruction. Knowledge was seen as empowerment, a tool to navigate both the practical challenges of daily life and the broader questions of justice, governance, and community. The 18th century also witnessed the beginnings of cultural identity distinct from Europe. Literature, art, and performance began to reflect colonial experiences, blending European traditions with local realities. Music, storytelling, and crafts became vehicles for expression, preserving memory, shaping identity, and fostering a sense of belonging. Even as settlers retained connections to their countries of origin, a unique colonial American culture began to emerge, one rooted in adaptation, resourcefulness, and shared experience across diverse landscapes and communities. Political awareness and engagement grew alongside these cultural developments. Colonists became increasingly conscious of their rights and responsibilities, debating the legitimacy of distant authority and asserting local interests. Conflicts over taxation, trade regulations, and representation began to surface, challenging assumptions about obedience and governance. These tensions were initially subtle, often expressed in pamphlets, petitions, and assemblies, but they reflected a growing consciousness of collective identity and the principles of fairness and autonomy. People began to question what it meant to be subjects of a distant crown and what rights they held as residents of the colonies, creating the intellectual and moral groundwork for future resistance. Interpersonal and intercultural dynamics also shaped the period. Interaction with indigenous peoples continued to be complex, involving trade, negotiation, and sometimes conflict. Alliances were forged and broken, treaties signed and violated. European settlers brought technologies and goods that transformed local economies, yet they also imposed new pressures on land and resources. Indigenous communities adapted, resisted, and negotiated as best they could, demonstrating resilience and strategic acumen in the face of an unprecedented influx of settlers. The continent itself became a stage on which the clash and blending of cultures unfolded, each encounter leaving lasting impacts on societies, landscapes, and relationships. As the colonies matured, new ideas of governance and representation took root. The concept of self-rule, though informal, became increasingly entrenched. Town meetings, councils, and assemblies allowed residents to participate in decision-making, debate issues, and develop local laws. These practices, initially pragmatic responses to the needs of growing communities, nurtured expectations of involvement, voice, and accountability. People began to see themselves not merely as subjects, but as stakeholders, shaping the lives of their communities and eventually envisioning broader structures of political organization. By the mid-18th century, population growth, economic development, and geographic expansion created both opportunities and pressures. Settlers pushed westward into new territories, exploring rivers, valleys, and plains. Agricultural techniques advanced, commerce expanded, and networks of communication strengthened. Yet with growth came competition for land, resources, and influence. Disputes over boundaries, trade rights, and political authority were increasingly common. The colonies were no longer simple extensions of European nations. They were dynamic societies, grappling with their own complexities, challenges, and aspirations. Cultural exchange, conflict, and adaptation continue to shape colonial society. European customs mixed with local practices, indigenous knowledge informed agricultural and survival strategies, and enslaved Africans contributed profoundly to the economy, culture, and skills of the colonies. This blending created a multifaceted society, rich in diversity but fraught with inequality and tension. Questions of power, representation, and justice became increasingly prominent as colonists evaluated their position within the Atlantic world, reflecting on both their dependencies and their capabilities. The stage was set for profound change. Economic pressures, political ideas, and cultural evolution converged to create an environment in which the colonies could envision life beyond mere survival or subordination. Enlightenment thought, emphasizing reason, individual rights, and the social contract, spread across the Atlantic, finding receptive audiences among educated and politically aware colonists. These ideas challenged traditional authority and planted the seeds of revolutionary thought, encouraging people to imagine societies based on principles of liberty, justice, and collective responsibility. By the latter half of the 18th century, the colonies had developed into a complex, interdependent network of communities, economies, and cultures. They were increasingly conscious of their distinct identity, shaped by a shared history of adaptation, resilience, and aspiration. This growing sense of self, combined with exposure to European political philosophy and local experiences of governance, would ignite debates over authority, rights, and independence. The foundations were laid not only for conflict, but also for the creation of a nation built upon ideas that had been evolving quietly, steadily, for more than a century. As the 18th century progressed, the relationship between the American colonies and Britain became increasingly strained. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire had grown vast, wealthy, and confident, wielding power over numerous territories and colonies. Britain sought to manage its colonies with a focus on trade, taxation, and strategic advantage. Initially, these policies were tolerated, even accepted, as the colonists benefited from protection, trade opportunities, and a shared sense of imperial identity. However, over time, economic pressures and political decisions from afar began to create tension, as the realities of distant governance clashed with the evolving aspirations of the colonies. One of the earliest and most contentious issues was taxation without representation. The British Parliament imposed taxes on goods and services within the colonies, such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, to help cover debts incurred during wars like the 7 Years' War. For the colonists, these taxes were more than a financial burden. They represented a principle of control that ignored their local autonomy and governance structures. Many colonists argued that it was unjust to levy taxes on them without their direct representation in the decision-making process, as they had grown accustomed to self-governance through town meetings, local councils, and assemblies. This idea, simple in its essence but profound in its implications, began to galvanize a collective consciousness that would define the coming decades. Resistance began in subtle ways. Pamphlets, essays, and newspapers spread ideas challenging the legitimacy of distant authority. Intellectual leaders, merchants, and ordinary citizens alike debated rights, obligations, and the nature of governance. Groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, orchestrating protests and boycotts that sent clear messages to British officials. These early acts of defiance were often symbolic but powerful, demonstrating the colonies' capacity for organized action and their willingness to protect perceived rights and freedoms. Communities that once focused on survival now focused also on principles, debating the balance between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to local interests. The Boston Massacre of 1770 further inflamed tensions. A confrontation between British soldiers and colonists, resulting in civilian deaths, became a symbol of oppression and a rallying point for resistance. News of the event spread rapidly through newspapers, speeches, and pamphlets, amplifying public outrage and unifying disparate groups around a common cause. The incident highlighted the deepening divide between those who believed in colonial rights and those who insisted on obedience to British authority. Emotions ran high, and the idea that ordinary citizens could influence their destiny became increasingly tangible. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 exemplified the escalation of resistance. In protest of the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company special privileges and reinforced the principle of taxation without representation, colonists disguised as indigenous peoples boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped valuable cargo into the water. This dramatic act was both a protest and a statement, a refusal to accept laws imposed without consent. Britain's response was swift and punitive, implementing the coercive acts which further restricted colonial autonomy and inflamed resentment. The colonies found themselves on a collision course with a distant empire that underestimated their determination, organization, and growing sense of identity. As tensions escalated, local militias became increasingly important. Ordinary farmers, tradesmen, and laborers trained with weapons, prepared to defend their homes, and coordinated with neighboring communities. These militias were not professional armies, yet they embodied the spirit of self-reliance and commitment to shared ideals. Training, drills, and communication networks created a sense of readiness, as ordinary people internalized the reality that political disputes could, and perhaps would, turn into open conflict. It was a time of uncertainty, but also of purpose, as the colonies collectively began to imagine a society capable of governing itself. The philosophical underpinnings of resistance drew heavily from Enlightenment thought. Writers and thinkers such as John Locke emphasized natural rights, social contracts, and the legitimacy of challenging governments that violated those rights. These ideas found fertile ground in the colonies, where local experience had already cultivated a sense of responsibility, autonomy, and justice. Ordinary people, informed by newspapers, sermons, and discussions in public spaces, began to connect abstract principles to concrete grievances. The belief that governance should reflect consent and serve the people became not merely an intellectual exercise, but a guiding principle of emerging political action. By 1774, the colonies were organizing in unprecedented ways. The First Continental Congress convened, bringing together representatives from different regions to coordinate responses to British policies. The discussions were intense, reflecting both diverse interests and a shared commitment to collective action. Delegates debated strategies ranging from continued negotiation to economic boycotts, preparing the colonies for what many recognized as an inevitable confrontation. Communication networks expanded, ensuring that ideas, instructions, and news traveled swiftly between communities, creating a sense of cohesion across vast distances. The year 1775 marked the outbreak of open conflict. Skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts signaled that negotiation had reached its limits. Shots fired at these small towns echoed across the continent, sparking the American Revolutionary War. Local militias confronted British troops, ordinary citizens joined the fight, and leaders emerged from the chaos with strategic vision and courage. The war was not simply a struggle for territory or wealth, it was a struggle for principles, identity, and the right to determine the course of one's own society. Military campaigns unfolded across the colonies, each region facing unique challenges. In New England, the rocky terrain and dense forests shaped tactics and strategies, while the southern colonies' plantations and waterways influenced mobility and supply lines. Battles were fought not only on open fields but also in towns, along rivers and across forests, often involving civilians who played crucial roles in logistics, intelligence, and support. The war required immense coordination, resilience, and sacrifice, as communities endured hardships, uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of loss. Leadership during the Revolution combined vision with pragmatism. Figures such as George Washington emerged, guiding the Continental Army with determination, while thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin provided the intellectual framework for independence. Their writings, strategies, and diplomacy helped transform a loosely organized rebellion into a coherent movement capable of challenging one of the world's most powerful empires. These leaders relied on both military skill and the support of ordinary people, whose courage, ingenuity, and persistence sustained the struggle through difficult winters, supply shortages, and moments of doubt. The war also brought into focus complex issues of loyalty, identity, and morality. Not all colonists supported independence. Loyalists remained committed to Britain, creating divisions within families, communities, and regions. Indigenous nations faced difficult choices, as alliances with either side could determine survival or devastation. Enslaved Africans saw the conflict as an opportunity to negotiate freedom, sometimes joining one side or the other, their lives entangled in the broader struggle for liberty. These intersecting stories highlight the multifaceted nature of revolution, not merely a political event, but a profound societal transformation affecting every aspect of life. Over time, the tide of the war shifted through a combination of strategy, alliance, and resilience. The entry of France into the conflict in 1778 provided crucial military and financial support, altering the balance of power. Naval engagements, guerrilla tactics, and conventional battles combined to challenge British dominance. The conflict was protracted, exhausting, and unpredictable, yet the determination of the colonies, coupled with strategic alliances, gradually paved the way for eventual success. Victory required not only battlefield skill, but also diplomacy, coordination, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals of self-governance and liberty. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, was a defining moment, articulating the colony's collective vision for a society based on individual rights, justice, and representative government. It was more than a statement of rebellion. It was a manifesto of values, aspirations, and principles that would guide the new nation. The document drew on Enlightenment philosophy, colonial experience, and the lived realities of communities across the continent. Its language, ideals, and bold assertion of sovereignty inspired not only Americans, but also generations of people worldwide seeking freedom and self-determination. The Revolutionary War unfolded as a vast and complex struggle, stretching across the continent, testing the endurance, courage, and ingenuity of both soldiers and civilians. Battles were fought in towns, forests, riversides, and open fields, each shaped by local geography, weather, and resources. The Continental Army, initially poorly equipped and inexperienced, relied on determination, strategy, and the unwavering support of local militias to sustain their campaigns. Despite shortages of food, ammunition, and clothing, soldiers endured harsh winters, long marches, and the uncertainty of guerrilla warfare. Civilians, too, faced enormous challenges, as their homes and livelihoods became entangled in the larger conflict. New England was one of the most intensely contested regions. The early battles at Lexington and Concord set the tone for the revolutionary struggle, unexpected skirmishes that demonstrated the colony's ability to resist a professional army. Following these initial encounters, the Siege of Boston became a crucial early victory. Washington's leadership, combined with strategic positioning and the use of artillery brought from Fort Ticonderoga, forced the British to evacuate the city. This triumph was both symbolic and practical, boosting morale, proving that the Continental Army could confront the formidable British forces, and establishing patterns of perseverance and innovation that would recur throughout the war. The war expanded into the middle colonies, where cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Trenton became strategic focal points. The Battle of Long Island revealed the risks of confronting British forces in conventional engagements, as the colonies suffered setbacks and were forced to retreat. However, moments of ingenuity and bold action kept hope alive. Washington's daring crossing of the Delaware River on a frigid December night in 1776, leading to the surprise attack on Hessian forces in Trenton, became legendary. This victory, though modest in scale, reinvigorated morale, proving that determination and clever strategy could offset disadvantages in numbers and equipment. As the war continued, alliances became pivotal. France's entry into the conflict in 1778 marked a significant turning point, providing the colonies with essential naval support, financial resources, and experienced military leadership. The involvement of Spain and the Netherlands further complicated the global landscape, stretching British forces and resources across multiple fronts. These alliances reflected the interconnectedness of global politics, trade, and ambition, demonstrating that the American struggle for independence was not merely a local rebellion, but part of a broader international contest. The support from foreign allies provided crucial reinforcements and supplies, enabling sustained campaigns that would otherwise have been impossible. In the southern colonies, the war took on a different character. Vast plantations, dense forests, and long rivers shaped both strategy and logistics. Battles such as those at Charleston and Camden demonstrated the challenges of extended supply lines, local allegiances, and the need for adaptive tactics. Guerrilla warfare, led by figures like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, proved effective in harassing British forces, disrupting supply chains, and maintaining resistance despite the enemy's superior numbers and training. Local knowledge, mobility, and determination turned the Southern theater into a dynamic and unpredictable battlefield, where ordinary citizens and soldiers alike played crucial roles in sustaining the revolutionary effort. Life for civilians during the war was precarious. Families were often forced to flee their homes, communities faced shortages of food and resources, and the constant threat of violence hung over daily life. Women played essential roles, maintaining farms, households, and supply lines, while also sometimes acting as messengers, spies, and supporters of military operations. Indigenous nations faced difficult choices, as alliances with either the British or colonial forces carried potential consequences for survival and sovereignty. Enslaved Africans navigated the tumultuous landscape, seeking freedom where possible, sometimes joining one side or the other in hopes of changing their circumstances. Every individual's actions, whether on the battlefield or in everyday life, contributed to the complex tapestry of the revolutionary experience. The Continental Congress provided essential leadership, coordinating war efforts, diplomacy, and governance. They navigated the immense challenge of sustaining a war effort with limited resources, raising funds through bonds, loans, and contributions from sympathetic supporters both domestically and abroad. Efforts to standardize currency, manage logistics, and coordinate military strategy required ingenuity and persistence. The Congress also faced internal debates over the allocation of resources, priorities of strategy, and the role of state versus national authority, reflecting the delicate balance between local autonomy and collective action that had been developing for decades. As the war progressed, major victories and setbacks punctuated the conflict. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777 was a decisive moment, demonstrating the colony's capacity to defeat a significant British force. This victory encouraged France to formalize its alliance, providing crucial military support and lending international legitimacy to the colonial cause. In contrast, battles in New Jersey and Pennsylvania showed the ongoing difficulties of sustaining an army in the field, where winter, disease, and logistical challenges threatened to undermine morale. Each engagement, whether victory or defeat, shaped strategy, leadership, and public perception, reinforcing the idea that resilience and adaptability were as important as sheer numbers or firepower. Throughout the war, communication and coordination were vital. Couriers, letters, and coded messages connected distant theaters of operation, while local militias coordinated with the Continental Army to exploit opportunities and respond to threats. Strategic use of intelligence, espionage, and alliances allowed the colonies to punch above their weight, compensating for material disadvantages. Leaders like Washington, Lafayette, and Rochambeau leveraged not only tactical skill, but also diplomacy, negotiation, and timing to maintain momentum. Every movement of troops, every calculation of supply lines, and every decision to engage or retreat reflected a careful blend of pragmatism, courage, and foresight. The harsh winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 exemplified the struggle and resilience of the revolutionary cause. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, scarcity of food, inadequate clothing, and rampant disease. Yet this period also became a crucible of training, organization, and camaraderie. Under the guidance of officers like Baron von Steuben, the Continental Army improved discipline, tactics, and cohesion, emerging as a more effective fighting force. The hardships endured by soldiers and their families during this time deepened commitment to the cause, forging bonds of loyalty, determination, and shared sacrifice that would sustain the war effort. Naval engagements also played a crucial role. Control of ports, rivers, and coastlines influenced supply lines, trade, and troop movements. The fledgling American Navy, though small, employed innovative strategies to harass British shipping and disrupt logistics. Privateers, authorized to attack enemy vessels, added to the pressure on British forces while simultaneously allowing colonists to gain material support and experience. These efforts, while often overlooked in traditional narratives, were vital to sustaining morale, applying pressure on the British, and enabling the broader strategic framework that eventually led to success. By the early 1780s, the war had evolved into a protracted struggle of endurance, strategy, and international diplomacy. The British, stretched thin across multiple global conflicts and facing persistent colonial resistance, found their position increasingly untenable. The culmination of military campaigns, strategic alliances, and persistent grassroots support eventually led to the decisive siege of Yorktown in 1781. British forces, led by General Cornwallis, were surrounded by combined American and French troops, effectively ending major combat operations. Victory was not immediate or absolute, but the event signaled the turning of the tide and the imminent realization of the colony's long-sought independence. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally ended the war and recognized the sovereignty of the United States. The treaty acknowledged colonial borders, secured fishing rights, and established the framework for the United States to emerge as a new nation on the world stage. Independence, however, was not the end of challenges. It was the beginning of a complex journey of nation-building, governance, and defining the values and institutions that would guide society. The revolution had transformed not only political structures, but also the collective consciousness, instilling a sense of identity, purpose, and the possibilities of self-determination that would continue to shape the American story. With independence secured, the newly formed United States faced the monumental task of transforming revolutionary ideals into a functioning government. The joy of victory was tempered by the complexities of creating a nation from 13 distinct colonies, each with its own economy, culture, and political traditions. The Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781, represented the first attempt to unify the states under a common framework. While it established a national Congress and created a sense of collective identity, the Articles proved inadequate for addressing economic challenges, coordinating defense, and regulating trade, revealing the delicate balance between local autonomy and national authority that had long shaped colonial life. Economic pressures were immediate and profound. The war had left the new nation with massive debts, disrupted trade networks, and unstable currency systems. Farmers, merchants, and artisans struggled to stabilize livelihoods, while veterans sought recognition and compensation for their service. Disputes over taxes, land, and commerce emerged within and between states, highlighting the need for a stronger, more cohesive system of governance. The experience of war, however, had fostered a growing sense of shared purpose and identity. Communities were willing to engage in dialogue, compromise, and experimentation to create structures that could sustain the ideals of liberty, justice, and self-determination. In 1787, leaders from across the states convened in Philadelphia for what became the Constitutional Convention. Delegates brought diverse perspectives, experiences, and visions for the nation, debating fundamental questions about power, representation, and governance. Some advocated for strong, centralized authority to maintain order and stability, while others emphasized the preservation of state sovereignty and individual rights. The challenge was immense: how to create a system that balanced these competing interests, protected liberties, and provided a framework for growth, all while learning from the mistakes of the past. The resulting United States Constitution was a remarkable achievement of negotiation, compromise, and foresight. It established a federal system, dividing powers between national and state governments, and created three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, designed to check and balance one another. Representation was addressed through a bicameral legislature, balancing population-based influence with equal representation for each state. These structural innovations reflected both practical needs and philosophical ideals, drawing on Enlightenment thought, colonial experience, and an understanding of human nature. The Constitution was both a product of its time and a living framework intended to endure, capable of adaptation through amendments and interpretation. The ratification process was intense and often contentious. Federalists who supported a strong central government argued that unity and stability were essential for economic growth, national security, and international credibility. Anti-federalists, wary of concentrated power, demanded protections for individual rights and fears of tyranny. The promise of a Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, helped secure consensus by enumerating freedoms such as speech, religion, and due process, reflecting a commitment to safeguarding liberty while building a functional government. The delicate negotiation between authority and freedom set the tone for the political culture of the United States, emphasizing dialogue, compromise, and the pursuit of shared goals. Meanwhile, the young nation faced pressing external and internal challenges. Relations with European powers remained delicate, as Britain, France, and Spain navigated their own geopolitical interests while interacting with the United States. Trade disputes, border tensions, and lingering British influence in the Northwest Territory required careful diplomacy. Internally, the new government confronted rebellions and unrest, as seen in events like Shays' Rebellion, where economic hardship and perceived injustices prompted armed protest. These challenges highlighted the necessity of a responsive, adaptable government and reinforced the importance of balancing authority, representation, and civic engagement. Under the leadership of the first President George Washington, the nation navigated these formative years with a focus on stability, precedent, and unity. Washington's presidency established essential practices, including the peaceful transfer of power, the role of the executive in policy and diplomacy, and the principle of national service above personal ambition. His leadership combined moral authority, practical judgment, and an understanding of the delicate dynamics between states, the federal government, and international partners. Washington's example became a benchmark for future leaders, illustrating the importance of character, foresight, and dedication in guiding a fledgling nation. The early republic also confronted profound social, economic, and cultural changes. Expansion into Western territories, facilitated by treaties and migration, created opportunities and conflicts. Settlers encountered indigenous nations with established societies, trade networks, and cultural traditions, resulting in negotiation, displacement, and in some cases violent confrontation. Economic innovation flourished as trade networks, banking systems, and agricultural practices evolved to meet the needs of a growing population. Literacy and education spread, supporting civic engagement and the development of a shared national identity grounded in both local experience and emerging national values. Political divisions began to emerge, reflecting differing visions for the future. The Federalist Party, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, advocated for strong central governance, industrial development, and close ties with Britain. The Democratic Republicans, championed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, emphasized states' rights, agrarian ideals, and closer relations with France. These debates were not merely theoretical. They shaped policies on taxation, banking, foreign affairs, and infrastructure, influencing the trajectory of the nation. The healthy tension between competing visions fostered political engagement, innovation, and the development of institutions capable of accommodating diverse perspectives. Foreign relations in the early republic were a delicate balancing act. Britain, despite recognizing American independence, maintained influence in trade and diplomacy, while France, having assisted in the revolution, sought to assert its interests. Spain controlled territories to the south and west, while Native American nations navigated shifting alliances to protect their lands and sovereignty. Diplomatic negotiations, treaties, and occasional military conflicts demonstrated the complexity of the international environment and underscored the importance of strategic foresight, negotiation skills, and national cohesion. The young United States had to assert its place in the world while safeguarding domestic stability and promoting economic development. Slavery remained a profound moral, social, and economic challenge. While northern states gradually moved toward emancipation, the southern economy relied heavily on enslaved labor to sustain agriculture and commerce. Debates over slavery's expansion, representation in Congress, and human rights shaped political discourse and foreshadowed conflicts that would intensify over the coming decades. The contradictions between revolutionary ideals of liberty and the realities of slavery created tensions that were woven into the very fabric of the new nation, influencing policy, society, and the struggle for justice for generations to come. Infrastructure and economic development progressed alongside these political and social challenges. Roads, canals, and ports were developed to facilitate trade and migration, linking distant regions and enabling economic growth. Agriculture diversified, commerce expanded, and nascent industries began to take root. Urban centers grew, serving as hubs of trade, governance, and culture, while rural areas maintained agrarian traditions that shaped local identities and economies. The interplay between urban and rural development, regional specialization, and national cohesion became central to understanding the evolution of the United States during these foundational years. Culturally, the early republic was a period of exploration, adaptation, and expression. Literature, art, and public discourse reflected both the heritage of European traditions and the distinct experiences of life in America. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated widely, encouraging debate, education, and civic participation. Religious diversity expanded, with new denominations emerging alongside established traditions, influencing community life, values, and social norms. Music, storytelling, and visual arts provided not only entertainment, but also a means of exploring identity, history, and aspiration, helping to forge a shared sense of national culture amidst regional diversity. By the end of the 1790s, the United States had established a functioning, if imperfect, government, with growing economic stability, emerging infrastructure, and a developing international presence. The experiences of independence, war, and governance had instilled resilience, adaptability, and a sense of collective purpose. Yet the nation remained a work in progress, continually negotiating the balance between liberty and order, unity and diversity, tradition and innovation. These foundational decades shaped the trajectory of the United States, setting the stage for expansion, conflict, and transformation in the 19th century. As the United States entered the early 19th century, the nation's focus turned to growth, expansion, and defining its identity in a rapidly changing world. The vast lands to the west represented both opportunity and challenge, promising resources, agricultural potential, and space for a growing population. Yet these lands were not empty. They were home to indigenous nations with established societies, cultures, and economies. Expansion into these territories required negotiation, strategic alliances, and often violent displacement, as settlers, driven by ambition and necessity, pushed beyond the original 13 states. The consequences of this westward movement would shape the social, cultural, and political landscape for decades. One of the most transformative moments of early expansion was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Negotiated under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States acquired a vast territory from France, effectively doubling the nation's size overnight. This acquisition opened the Mississippi River and its tributaries to American trade, created opportunities for settlement and agriculture, and enhanced the nation's strategic position on the continent. The Louisiana Purchase also raised questions about federal power, governance, and constitutional authority, as Jefferson's decision challenged traditional interpretations while demonstrating pragmatic vision in pursuit of national interest. Exploration followed acquisition, as expeditions sought to map, understand, and document the vast new territory. The Lewis and Clark expedition, commissioned by Jefferson, exemplified the combination of curiosity, science, and ambition that characterized this era. Lewis, Clark, and their team traveled thousands of miles, recording geographical features, cataloging plants and animals, and interacting with Native American nations. Their journey was both scientific and diplomatic, as alliances, trade, and mutual understanding with indigenous peoples proved essential for survival and success. These explorations expanded not only geographic knowledge, but also the imagination of the nation, fostering a sense of possibility, discovery, and destiny. Westward expansion was accompanied by profound social and economic changes. Agricultural practices evolved, with settlers introducing new crops, livestock, and techniques suited to diverse environments. Towns and trading posts emerged along rivers and trails, linking remote settlements to broader networks of commerce and communication. The development of roads, canals, and eventually railroads facilitated the movement of goods, people, and information, knitting together a sprawling territory into a more cohesive economic and social fabric. These infrastructural innovations were critical to national growth, connecting distant regions and enabling both migration and trade. At the same time, the displacement of Native American nations intensified. Treaties were often negotiated under duress, and promises were frequently broken, leading to forced removals, loss of ancestral lands, and cultural disruption. Policies and practices during this period reflected the complex interplay between ambition, ideology, and prejudice, as settlers and governments prioritized expansion over indigenous sovereignty. The consequences of these actions were profound, reshaping the demographics, culture, and power dynamics of the continent, while sowing seeds of conflict and resistance that would endure for generations. The early 19th century also saw the emergence of industrialization, particularly in the northern states. Factories, mills, and workshops began to transform production, shifting some communities from agrarian economies to industrial ones. Innovations in textile manufacturing, ironworks, and transportation technology spurred economic growth, creating jobs, attracting immigrants, and fostering urbanization. This industrial transformation contrasted with the largely agrarian South, where plantations and cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice remained dominant. The divergence between industrial and agrarian regions would have lasting implications for politics, culture, and ultimately national unity. Transportation innovations revolutionized connectivity and commerce. Canals such as the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, provided critical links between inland agricultural regions and coastal markets. Steamboats enabled faster, more reliable travel and trade along rivers, while the early development of railroads expanded possibilities for movement of goods and people. These innovations not only facilitated economic growth, but also encouraged migration, settlement, and the spread of ideas, helping to knit together a nation that was geographically vast and culturally diverse. Political developments during this period reflected both continuity and transformation. The presidency of James Madison and the experience of the War of 1812 reinforced national identity, patriotism, and international credibility. The conflict, often called the Second War of Independence, was sparked by British interference in American trade and impressment of sailors, testing the resilience and determination of the young nation. While the war ended in a stalemate militarily, it boosted national confidence, fostered a sense of shared purpose, and stimulated domestic manufacturing, as reliance on European imports was curtailed. Social reform movements began to emerge alongside expansion and industrialization. Religious revivalism, often associated with the Second Great Awakening, inspired new approaches to education, morality, and civic responsibility. Abolitionism, women's rights, and temperance gained traction, reflecting a growing awareness of social justice, individual rights, and moral responsibility. These movements often intersected with political debates, regional tensions, and cultural shifts, creating a dynamic environment in which ideas about freedom, equality, and social progress were actively contested and redefined. Economic growth, however, was uneven, and disparities between regions became increasingly apparent. The North embraced industrialization, urbanization, and a diversified economy, while the South relied heavily on agriculture and enslaved labor. These differences shaped political debates over tariffs, trade policies, and infrastructure investment, highlighting the interconnectedness of economics and governance. At the same time, migration westward introduced new territories with potential for settlement, commerce, and statehood, creating questions about representation, governance, and the extension of political and economic systems. Culturally, the early 19th century was a period of literary, artistic, and intellectual ferment. Writers such as Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper explored American landscapes, history, and identity, blending European literary traditions with distinctly American themes. Visual arts, including painting and engraving, depicted both frontier life and emerging urban centers, providing records of landscapes, daily activities, and cultural transformations. These cultural expressions reinforced a growing sense of national identity, celebrating achievement, exploration, and the unique character of life in the United States. The issue of slavery increasingly dominated political and social discourse. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 revolutionized cotton production, intensifying reliance on enslaved labor in the South. As new territories opened for settlement, debates over the extension of slavery, representation in Congress, and economic interests created tensions between North and South. These conflicts were complex, rooted in economics, culture, morality, and power, and they set the stage for political struggles that would escalate over the coming decades. Immigration began to influence demographics, culture, and labor markets. People from Europe, particularly Ireland and Germany, arrived in growing numbers, seeking opportunities, freedom, and stability. Immigrants contributed to economic development, urban growth, and cultural diversity, while also encountering social and political challenges. Their presence highlighted the dynamic nature of the young nation, reflecting both its appeal as a land of opportunity and the tensions inherent in integrating diverse populations into a cohesive society. The early 19th century was also marked by territorial ambition and diplomacy. Treaties with Britain, Spain, and indigenous nations shaped boundaries, secured trade routes, and attempted to manage conflicts arising from settlement and expansion. The acquisition of Florida from Spain, negotiations over the northern border with Britain, and ongoing westward settlement illustrated the interplay of diplomacy, ambition, and practical governance. Each success and setback contributed to a growing awareness of the challenges of nationhood, international relations, and the management of diverse populations and landscapes. By the 1820s, the United States had transformed from a fragile post-revolutionary confederation into a nation characterized by growth, innovation, and increasing influence. Yet the nation remained a work in progress, grappling with internal divisions, unresolved social issues, and the complex consequences of expansion. The patterns of industrialization, territorial acquisition, cultural expression, and political debate established during this period laid the groundwork for the profound transformations that would define the mid and late 19th century. As the United States moved deeper into the 19th century, the young nation confronted the growing reality of sectionalism, the distinct political, economic, and cultural differences that increasingly divided the North, South, and West. These divisions were not merely abstract. They reflected contrasting economies, social structures, and visions for the nation's future. The North embraced industrialization, urban growth, and wage labor, while the South remained heavily reliant on agriculture, particularly cotton, supported by the institution of slavery. The Western territories offered new opportunities for settlement and development, but also posed questions about governance, representation, and the expansion of these regional economic systems. One of the earliest and most significant attempts to balance these competing interests was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. As Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, tensions arose between northern and southern states over the balance of power in Congress. The compromise, brokered by Henry Clay, admitted Missouri as a slave state while simultaneously admitting Maine as a free state, and establishing a geographic line separating future free and slave territories. This arrangement was a temporary solution to a profound and growing conflict, illustrating the delicate negotiation required to maintain unity in a nation with diverging interests. It was a vivid example of how political compromise, while necessary, often masked deeper societal tensions rather than resolving them. The early decades of the 1800s also saw the rise of political parties and the evolution of the American democratic system. The Democratic Republicans, dominant in the early Republic, gradually gave way to new alignments, including the Democratic Party, led by Andrew Jackson, and the emerging Whig Party, which opposed certain aspects of Jacksonian policies. These developments reflected the growing participation of ordinary citizens in politics, as suffrage expanded to include more white men and campaigns increasingly relied on popular mobilization. Elections became contests of ideas, personality, and strategy, shaping the nation's policies on banking, tariffs, infrastructure, and westward expansion, while also revealing the tensions inherent in balancing majority rule with minority rights. Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1820s and 1830s exemplified the rise of a more populist, assertive political leadership. Jackson championed the common man, opposed concentrated financial power such as the National Bank, and supported policies of territorial expansion. His administration also enforced the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a policy that forcibly displaced thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the Southeast, creating the tragic Trail of Tears. This episode highlighted the human cost of expansion, as ambition and economic development collided with the rights, culture, and lives of indigenous populations. The removal of Native Americans, while rationalized at the time as necessary for progress, left a legacy of displacement, suffering, and cultural erasure that would echo through generations. Meanwhile, industrialization and urbanization accelerated in the north, creating new social dynamics and economic opportunities. Factories produced textiles, iron, and other goods on an increasing scale, attracting labor from rural areas and immigrants from Europe. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York expanded rapidly, bringing with them challenges of sanitation, housing, and public services, as well as opportunities for cultural development, commerce, and political engagement. Technological innovations, such as the steam engine, mechanized textile looms, and improved transportation networks, reshaped work, daily life, and the economic landscape, further deepening the divide between industrial and agrarian regions. At the same time, social reform movements gained momentum. Abolitionism, inspired by moral, religious, and philosophical arguments, grew in intensity as activists sought to challenge the institution of slavery and its expansion into new territories. Women's rights advocates, temperance movements, and educational reformers also pushed for changes that reflected evolving ideas of equality, morality, and social responsibility. These movements often intersected with political debates, migration patterns, and economic shifts, creating a dynamic environment in which ideas about justice, freedom, and progress were constantly negotiated. Territorial expansion continued to shape national politics and identity. The annexation of Texas in 1845, following its independence from Mexico, brought new challenges regarding the extension of slavery and relations with neighboring nations. The Mexican-American War, fought from 1846 to 1848, resulted in significant territorial gains for the United States, including California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. These acquisitions fueled debates over the balance of power between free and slave states, intensified sectionalism, and highlighted the moral, economic, and political complexities of expansion. While the nation gained valuable land and resources, the costs of war, displacement of indigenous populations, and internal divisions underscored the difficulties inherent in growth and ambition. Economic development during this period reflected both regional specialization and national integration. The South expanded its plantation economy, with cotton dominating exports and driving domestic and international trade. The North diversified, embracing manufacturing, commerce, and transportation infrastructure. The West offered agricultural potential, mining opportunities, and strategic locations for trade and settlement. Canals, railroads, and roads connected these regions, facilitating commerce and migration, yet also revealed the unevenness of development and the growing disparities between regions with different economic priorities and labor systems. Cultural life mirrored these transformations. Literature, art, and philosophy explored themes of expansion, identity, and morality, reflecting both pride and tension in the American experience. Writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau celebrated individualism, self-reliance, and a connection to nature, offering philosophical frameworks for understanding the nation's growth. Meanwhile, newspapers, pamphlets, and public lectures fostered political debate, education, and civic engagement, helping citizens navigate the complexities of social change, expansion, and sectional differences. These cultural developments were intertwined with economic, political, and social dynamics, shaping a collective understanding of what it meant to be American. The intensifying debate over slavery culminated in legislative and political crises. The Compromise of 1850, orchestrated to address the status of territories acquired from Mexico, attempted to balance interests by admitting California as a free state, enforcing a stricter fugitive slave law, and allowing popular sovereignty in new territories. While this compromise temporarily eased tensions, it also exposed the fragility of national unity and the limits of legislative solutions. The debates, protests, and political maneuvering surrounding slavery revealed the deep moral and economic divisions that permeated every level of society. Technological innovation continued to transform the landscape and economy. The telegraph revolutionized communication, enabling near-instantaneous transmission of information across vast distances. Railroads expanded rapidly, linking cities, towns, and agricultural regions, facilitating trade, migration, and military movement. Innovations in agriculture, such as improved plows and mechanized harvesting equipment, increased productivity and allowed settlement of new lands. These changes accelerated economic integration, yet also highlighted disparities between regions, labor systems, and access to capital, further intensifying sectional tensions and shaping the debates that would dominate mid-century politics. By the 1850s, the United States had grown geographically, economically, and culturally, yet it faced mounting challenges. The westward movement, economic divergence, social reform movements, and the intensifying debate over slavery created a complex and often volatile environment. Political compromises, while temporarily effective, increasingly masked deeper moral, cultural, and economic conflicts. The nation stood on the precipice of transformation, its growth and achievements shadowed by divisions that threatened the very fabric of unity, justice, and the principles for which the revolution had been fought. As the mid-19th century approached, the United States faced an increasingly volatile combination of expansion, political compromise, and moral conflict, all centered around the institution of slavery. The nation's westward growth created new territories, each sparking fierce debates over whether they would permit slavery. The Missouri Compromise of decades earlier had temporarily balanced free and slave states. But as the frontier expanded, this uneasy balance was repeatedly tested. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas, allowed settlers in these new territories to determine for themselves whether to permit slavery, a concept known as popular sovereignty. While framed as a democratic solution, it ignited violence, political upheaval, and moral outrage, giving rise to the term Bleeding Kansas, where armed conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers became a grim symbol of the nation's growing fracture. The political landscape shifted dramatically during this period. The Whig Party, unable to reconcile divisions over slavery, dissolved, paving the way for the rise of the Republican Party, founded in 1854 with a clear anti-slavery platform. This new party rapidly gained support in the North, attracting abolitionists, former Whigs, free soilers, and those opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. Political debates became increasingly polarized, reflecting not only moral differences, but also economic interests, regional identities, and fears about the future balance of power. Presidential elections became referendums on slavery, testing the ability of the United States to maintain unity in the face of profound disagreement. During this time, landmark court decisions further intensified the sectional crisis. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be considered citizens, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. This ruling outraged abolitionists and Northern politicians, who saw it as a blatant expansion of slaveholding power and a denial of basic human rights. Conversely, the South interpreted it as validation of their way of life and economic system. The decision deepened mistrust, hardened sectional identities, and made compromise increasingly difficult, signaling that the national conversation was moving toward confrontation rather than reconciliation. The economic and social differences between North and South continued to widen. The industrializing North relied on wage labor, factories, and commerce, fostering urban centers and technological innovation. In contrast, the Southern economy remained heavily dependent on plantations, cash crops, and enslaved labor. reinforcing hierarchical social structures and a culture that prioritized land ownership and agricultural expertise. These divergent systems were increasingly incompatible, with disputes over tariffs, infrastructure spending, and westward expansion reflecting deeper conflicts over values, labor, and political influence. Each region developed distinct identities, economic priorities, and visions for the nation's future. Cultural and intellectual life mirrored these tensions. Abolitionist writers, lecturers, and activists, such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, campaigned vigorously against slavery, using newspapers, speeches, and publications to expose the moral and human costs of bondage. Meanwhile, Southern writers and politicians defended the institution as essential to their economy, culture, and way of life. The clash of ideas was not abstract. It shaped communities, fueled political campaigns, and influenced public perception, deepening the divide between North and South. Even literature and art reflected these tensions, with stories, paintings, and essays exploring themes of freedom, morality, labor, and human dignity, further embedding the issue of slavery into the national consciousness. In addition to slavery, territorial expansion continued to drive conflict. The annexation of new lands following the Mexican-American War required decisions about the status of slavery, governance, and relations with Native American populations. Treaties, negotiations, and occasional military confrontations highlighted the complexity of integrating vast, diverse territories into a cohesive national framework. Settlers often faced harsh conditions, from disease and extreme weather to unfamiliar landscapes, while indigenous nations were forced to navigate displacement, broken treaties, and the erosion of sovereignty. Expansion was both opportunity and crisis, promising growth while revealing deep structural tensions within the nation. Political violence became increasingly visible as the country struggled to contain conflicts through legislation alone. In Kansas, armed clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers left communities torn, homes burned, and lives lost. The intensity of these conflicts demonstrated that the traditional tools of negotiation, compromise, and legislation were insufficient to manage the moral and political divisions threatening the Union. Newspapers and pamphlets across the country amplified the events, shaping public opinion, galvanizing movements, and further polarizing citizens who increasingly identified their political beliefs with regional and moral identities. The question of states' rights versus federal authority remained central to these debates. Southern leaders argued that states had the sovereign right to determine their own laws, including the legality of slavery, and threatened secession if perceived threats to their system were not respected. Northern politicians and citizens, increasingly committed to halting the expansion of slavery, insisted that the federal government had a responsibility to limit the spread of the institution, protect individual rights, and maintain national integrity. This tension between local autonomy and national authority became a recurring theme, shaping debates over taxation, infrastructure, suffrage, and ultimately the future of the Union. Meanwhile, the country continued to grow economically and technologically. Railroads, canals, and roads connected distant regions, facilitating trade, migration, and communication. Innovations in agriculture and manufacturing increased productivity and reshaped labor markets. Urban centers expanded, attracting immigrants and fostering cultural exchange. Yet these developments also highlighted inequalities and regional disparities, as infrastructure investments and industrial growth were concentrated in some areas while others lagged behind. The uneven pace of progress underscored the broader social, economic, and political divides that were increasingly driving national conflict. Political discourse became increasingly heated. Debates in Congress, newspapers, and public forums were marked by acrimony, mistrust, and moral conviction. Leaders such as Abraham Lincoln emerged as voices calling for national unity, the containment of slavery's expansion, and adherence to the principles of liberty enshrined in the nation's founding documents. Conversely, Southern leaders, convinced that their way of life and economic interests were under threat, prepared to defend their positions with increasing urgency. The stage was set for a national crisis in which political negotiation would soon give way to armed conflict. By the late 1850s, the United States had reached a precarious tipping point. Expansion, industrialization, social reform, and political realignment had transformed the nation, yet unresolved moral and economic conflicts over slavery, state sovereignty, and national identity persisted. Events in Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, and the rise of the Republican Party highlighted the impossibility of maintaining equilibrium through compromise alone. The nation stood divided, with citizens increasingly aligning along sectional lines and with political, social, and economic pressures converging toward a moment of profound and inevitable confrontation. The election of 1860 would prove the culmination of these tensions. Abraham Lincoln, representing the Republican Party's anti-slavery expansion platform, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. His election was perceived in the South as a direct threat to the institution of slavery and their way of life. Southern states, feeling politically marginalized and socially endangered, began to consider secession, arguing that the Union no longer protected their rights or interests. This decision set into motion a sequence of events that would plunge the nation into the most devastating conflict in its history. The nation, once united in its pursuit of liberty and independence, now faced a profound rupture. By early 1861, following the election of Abraham Lincoln, Southern states began to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The stage was set for the Civil War, a conflict that would test the endurance of the United States, redefine its principles, and reshape its society. The initial secession of South Carolina in December 1860 triggered a cascade of departures, with Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas following soon after. These states, motivated by the desire to preserve slavery and assert state sovereignty, argued that the Union had violated their rights and could no longer protect their economic and social systems. The first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861, a symbolic and literal opening of hostilities. Federal troops and Confederate forces clashed in Charleston Harbor, and the attack galvanized the North, transforming political tensions into armed conflict. Volunteers rushed to enlist. States organized militias, and the nation prepared for a war of unprecedented scale and consequence. Leaders on both sides understood that the outcome would determine not only political control, but also the moral and economic future of the continent, with every battle carrying implications for the lives, liberty, and prosperity of millions. The Union, led by President Lincoln and generals such as Ulysses S. Grant, faced the daunting challenge of preserving the nation. Early strategies focused on blockading southern ports to strangle trade, controlling the Mississippi River to divide Confederate territory, and applying pressure to Confederate armies to wear down their resources and morale. The Confederacy, under leaders such as Jefferson Davis and generals like Robert E. Lee, relied on defensive tactics, exploiting knowledge of local terrain and aiming to outlast the North's political will. Both sides recognized that the war would be long, grueling, and costly, with success dependent not only on military skill, but also on the resilience of civilian populations and the management of logistics, supplies, and communication. Battles such as Bull Run, Antietam, and Gettysburg became defining moments, each illustrating the scale, brutality, and strategic complexity of the conflict. At Bull Run, early optimism met harsh reality, as inexperienced troops confronted the chaos of battle and learned the deadly consequences of underestimating their opponent. Antietam, marked by staggering casualties, demonstrated both the intensity of combat and the stakes involved, providing Lincoln with an opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which reframed the war as a moral crusade against slavery, while maintaining its objective of national preservation. Gettysburg, often considered the turning point, saw Union forces repel Confederate advances in a decisive confrontation, shifting momentum and signaling that the Confederacy's path to victory was narrowing. The war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield. Economically, the conflict disrupted trade, manufacturing, and agriculture. In the South, blockades and destruction of infrastructure strained plantations and towns, while Northern industry expanded to support the war effort, producing weapons, uniforms, and supplies at unprecedented scale. Civilians experienced shortages, inflation, and the constant anxiety of conflict encroaching upon their communities. The social fabric was tested as families were divided by ideology, geography, and military service, while African Americans, both enslaved and free, navigated opportunities and dangers presented by the war, seeking freedom, protection, and a voice in shaping the nation's future. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 marked a profound shift in the war's purpose and in American society. Lincoln declared the freedom of all enslaved individuals in Confederate-held territories, transforming the conflict from a struggle for preservation of the Union to a broader fight for human liberty. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it altered the moral and political landscape, allowing African Americans to enlist in the Union Army and Navy, further strengthening Northern forces. This pivotal decision linked military strategy to moral imperative, redefining the stakes and ensuring that the nation's foundational values of freedom and equality would be central to the war effort. Military campaigns during the war were vast and complex. In the East, battles in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania tested leadership, strategy, and endurance. In the West, control of rivers, fortifications, and key cities became essential to dividing Confederate territory and disrupting supply lines. The war was marked by sieges, rapid maneuvers, and devastating frontal assaults, resulting in unprecedented casualties and suffering. Leaders on both sides grappled with logistical challenges, terrain, weather, and the unpredictability of combat, while soldiers endured harsh conditions, disease, and the psychological toll of relentless warfare. Each engagement carried consequences not only for immediate military objectives, but also for national morale, political support, and the broader trajectory of the conflict. As the war progressed, the human cost became staggering. Casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with wounds, disease, and starvation compounding the suffering. Families mourned lost sons, brothers, and fathers, while communities struggled to maintain cohesion amidst widespread disruption. The use of new technologies, including rifled muskets, ironclad ships, and telegraph communications, increased the efficiency and lethality of combat, further intensifying the horrors experienced on both sides. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from soldiers and civilians offer vivid testimony to the emotional, physical, and moral challenges faced during this period, reflecting the profound human dimension of the conflict. African Americans played a transformative role in the war effort. Escaping enslaved individuals sought refuge behind Union lines, contributing labor, intelligence, and military service. Black regiments, such as the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, demonstrated valor and determination, challenging prevailing prejudices and laying the groundwork for social and political change. Their participation not only strengthened the Union's military capacity, but also symbolized the broader moral purpose of the war, linking the struggle for national unity with the fight for human dignity and equality. The Union's industrial and logistical advantage gradually became decisive. Northern factories, railroads, and telegraph networks supported sustained military campaigns, allowing for the movement of troops, supplies, and information across vast distances. The South, despite early successes and skilled military leadership, struggled to match this capacity, facing shortages of arms, food, and equipment. Blockades, economic disruption, and the erosion of civilian support further weakened Confederate resilience. The interplay between economic capacity, military strategy, and social cohesion highlighted the interconnected nature of war, demonstrating that victory relied not only on tactics, but also on the broader societal infrastructure supporting the conflict. The final campaigns of 1864 and 1865 brought the war to a climax. General Ulysses S. Grant's leadership in coordinating multi-front offensives, combined with General William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous March to the Sea, devastated Confederate resources and morale. Sherman's campaign, which cut through Georgia and the Carolinas, employed total war strategies that targeted both military and economic infrastructure, undermining the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies. Simultaneously, Grant's relentless pressure in Virginia forced Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee into defensive positions, gradually exhausting manpower and supplies. The culmination of these efforts set the stage for the Confederacy's eventual surrender and the restoration of the Union. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865 marked the formal end of the conflict. Lee's capitulation to Grant symbolized the collapse of the Confederate resistance and the preservation of the United States as a unified nation. Yet the war's legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. The abolition of slavery, codified in the 13th Amendment, represented a monumental social and moral shift, fundamentally transforming American society. The enormous human and economic costs of the war, the devastation of Southern infrastructure, and the psychological impact on veterans and civilians alike underscored the profound consequences of internal conflict, while also creating the conditions for reconstruction, reconciliation, and a redefinition of national identity. With the Civil War concluded, the United States faced the immense challenge of Reconstruction, a period of rebuilding not only physical infrastructure, but also political systems, social structures, and the moral fabric of the nation. The Southern states, devastated by years of conflict, had lost a significant portion of their labor force, much of their economic infrastructure, and most importantly, the institution of slavery that had defined their social and economic systems. Meanwhile, millions of formerly enslaved people emerged into freedom, carrying both hope and uncertainty as they navigated a world that had promised liberty but was often unwilling to provide equality. The Reconstruction era, beginning in 1865, was marked by ambitious but contentious efforts to integrate freed African Americans into the political, social, and economic life of the nation. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment aimed to secure voting rights regardless of race. These constitutional changes were revolutionary, reshaping the principles of American governance and redefining who could claim the rights and protections of citizenship. Yet the practical implementation of these amendments faced relentless resistance from segments of Southern society unwilling to accept racial equality, creating a tense and often violent environment. Freedmen's Bureau initiatives attempted to provide education, employment assistance, and legal support to formerly enslaved individuals. Schools were established across the South, teaching literacy and practical skills, while efforts were made to mediate labor contracts and protect civil rights. Despite limited resources and significant opposition, these programs laid the foundation for social and educational development, highlighting the transformative potential of federal intervention in a society emerging from the shadows of slavery. The Bureau's work also revealed the deep structural inequalities and cultural tensions that would shape Southern society for decades. Politically, Reconstruction was a period of experimentation and conflict. Radical Republicans in Congress pushed for stringent measures to secure the rights of freedmen and ensure loyalty to the Union, often clashing with Presidents Andrew Johnson and later successors who favored a more lenient approach toward the former Confederate states. Southern states were divided into military districts, and new governments were established under federal supervision, incorporating African American men into political life as voters, office holders, and civic leaders. This dramatic shift challenged long-standing hierarchies and provoked backlash, illustrating both the possibilities and limits of political reconstruction in a deeply divided society. Resistance to Reconstruction emerged in multiple forms, from legislative maneuvers to outright violence. White supremacist groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, engaged in intimidation, assault, and murder to undermine African American political participation and reassert white dominance. Laws known as black codes sought to restrict freedom and maintain social hierarchies reminiscent of slavery, targeting labor, mobility, and civil rights. The federal government responded with varying degrees of force, legislation, and intervention, but the struggle between progress and resistance defined the era, creating an environment of uncertainty, danger, and gradual negotiation of social norms. Economically, the South faced the dual challenge of rebuilding while transitioning from a slave-based economy to one reliant on wage labor and sharecropping. Plantations, destroyed by war or abandoned by fleeing owners, were reorganized, often under arrangements that perpetuated economic dependency. Sharecropping and tenant farming became widespread, binding African American and poor white families to landowners through cycles of debt and limited opportunity. Meanwhile, the northern economy continued to industrialize and expand, creating a stark contrast between regions and illustrating the uneven pace of development across the nation. The economic divergence reinforced social and political divisions while shaping migration patterns, labor practices, and opportunities for advancement. Socially and culturally, the period was one of both hope and tension. African Americans, newly free, sought to establish communities, churches, and educational institutions. Religious congregations played a central role in community cohesion, offering spiritual guidance, social support, and political organization. Literacy and education were viewed as critical tools for empowerment, enabling formerly enslaved individuals to engage with civic life, pursue economic opportunities, and assert their humanity in a society that had long denied them both. Cultural resilience in the face of adversity became a defining characteristic of African American communities, reflecting the enduring strength and creativity that would shape national identity over generations. Nationally, Reconstruction highlighted the challenges of federalism and the limits of constitutional authority. The balance between states' rights and federal enforcement became a central question, as Southern resistance threatened the protection of newly established civil rights. Military occupation, federal legislation, and constitutional amendments sought to safeguard equality, yet the practical enforcement of these rights often depended on local compliance, political will, and social acceptance. This tension between principle and practice revealed the complexities of governance in a diverse and divided nation, demonstrating that legal and moral frameworks alone could not guarantee justice without broader societal engagement. Amid these challenges, the period also witnessed remarkable achievements. African American men were elected to local, state, and national offices, participating directly in shaping policy and governance. Public education expanded, infrastructure was rebuilt, and the principles of citizenship were extended to millions previously excluded from political life. These successes, though fragile and often contested, represented significant steps toward equality, inclusion, and the realization of the nation's founding ideals. The accomplishments of Reconstruction, while uneven and incomplete, demonstrated the potential for transformative change in the aftermath of conflict and oppression. By the mid-1870s, however, Reconstruction began to wane. Political compromise, economic pressures, and northern fatigue with southern resistance led to the gradual withdrawal of federal oversight. The contested election of 1876 resulted in the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended military occupation of the South and allowed the reassertion of white democratic control. African Americans and their allies faced a resurgence of disenfranchisement, segregation, and violence, setting the stage for the era of Jim Crow laws and systemic racial inequality. The promise of Reconstruction was thus only partially fulfilled, leaving a complex legacy of progress, struggle, and enduring challenges. Nationally, the post-war period also saw continued economic expansion and industrialization, particularly in the North and West. Railroads, factories, and mining operations fueled growth, while innovations in communication, energy, and agriculture reshaped daily life and labor systems. Urban centers expanded, attracting domestic migrants and international immigrants, creating new cultural dynamics and opportunities. The contrast between the modernizing North and the largely agrarian South underscored the uneven pace of development and the persistence of regional disparities, shaping the political and social landscape of the United States in the decades to come. Culturally, literature, art, and historical reflection sought to make sense of the Civil War and its consequences. Writers and intellectuals grappled with questions of freedom, justice, and national identity, producing works that reflected both pride in victory and awareness of continuing inequalities. Public memory, commemoration of battles, and memorialization of soldiers shaped civic culture, while debates over the interpretation of history, heroism, and moral lessons reflected ongoing tensions between unity and regional identity. These cultural processes were integral to nation building, influencing education, public discourse, and collective understanding of the American experience. In the broader context, Reconstruction revealed fundamental truths about democracy, citizenship, and human rights. The abolition of slavery, the enfranchisement of African Americans, and the assertion of federal authority demonstrated the potential for transformative governance. Yet the limits of these reforms, constrained by social resistance, political compromise, and economic realities, highlighted the enduring struggle to reconcile ideals with practice. The nation emerged from Reconstruction both stronger in principle and challenged in implementation, facing the dual task of maintaining unity while addressing deep-seated inequalities and regional tensions. As the United States moved into the late 19th century, the nation entered a period of rapid industrialization and transformation, a time often referred to as the Gilded Age. This era was characterized by technological innovation, urban growth, the rise of powerful industrialists, and profound social change. Factories and mills expanded at an unprecedented pace, producing textiles, steel, and machinery that fueled economic growth and positioned the United States as an emerging industrial power. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, linking raw materials to factories, goods to markets, and people to new opportunities, while innovations such as the telegraph and later the telephone revolutionized communication, shrinking distances and accelerating commerce. Urban centers grew dramatically as rural populations and immigrants from Europe flocked to cities in search of work and opportunity. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became bustling hubs of industry, culture, and commerce. Yet rapid urbanization brought challenges of overcrowding, sanitation, and poverty. Tenement housing rose, often poorly constructed and cramped, while cities struggled to provide basic infrastructure such as clean water, sewage systems, and public transportation. Despite these difficulties, cities also became centers of education, culture, and innovation, fostering theaters, museums, universities, and newspapers that shaped a distinctly modern American society. The rise of industrial magnates, often called robber barons by critics, symbolized both the opportunities and inequalities of the era. Figures such as John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in steel, and Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads amassed enormous wealth, influencing markets, politics, and labor conditions. Their enterprises created jobs and fueled economic expansion, yet they also consolidated power, exploited labor, and contributed to stark disparities between the wealthy elite and the working poor. This concentration of wealth prompted debates about fairness, the role of government regulation, and the social responsibility of those who controlled the nation's most vital industries. Labor movements emerged in response to these conditions, seeking to improve wages, working hours, and safety for industrial workers. Strikes, protests, and unionization efforts became increasingly common, reflecting growing awareness among workers of their collective power. Events such as the Haymarket Affair and the Pullman strike revealed both the intensity of labor grievances and the sometimes violent responses from authorities and business owners. These struggles shaped labor law, worker rights, and public perceptions of industrialization, highlighting the tension between rapid economic growth and human welfare, and laying the groundwork for future reforms in labor and workplace standards. Immigration played a central role in shaping the social and economic fabric of the nation. Millions of people arrived from Europe, Asia, and other regions, seeking economic opportunity, political freedom, or refuge from famine, persecution, and war. Immigrants contributed labor, cultural diversity, and entrepreneurial energy, yet they often faced discrimination, harsh working conditions, and political marginalization. Ethnic neighborhoods formed in cities, maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to new realities, and institutions such as churches, schools, and mutual aid societies supported community cohesion. Immigration transformed the demographics of the nation, fueling both innovation and social tension, as diverse populations integrated into American life. Technological and scientific advancements accelerated during this period, transforming everyday life and economic production. The introduction of electricity and electric lighting reshaped industry and urban environments, while inventions such as the typewriter, sewing machine, and mechanized printing press improved productivity and efficiency. Scientific discoveries influenced agriculture, medicine, and engineering, enabling new methods of production, transportation, and communication. These innovations not only increased material wealth, but also altered social norms, cultural practices, and the pace of life, contributing to a dynamic and rapidly changing society. Political life in the Gilded Age reflected the complexities of rapid growth and social change. Political machines, most famously Tammany Hall in New York, exercised considerable influence through patronage, corruption, and mobilization of immigrant communities. At the same time, reform movements sought to address inequities in voting, government accountability, and public services, emphasizing the importance of civic engagement and transparency. National debates centered on tariffs, monetary policy, and the regulation of industries, highlighting the intersection of economic development, political power, and social responsibility. The era was marked by a tension between entrenched interests and emerging demands for reform, reflecting the growing pains of a modernizing nation. Economic development was uneven, with the South and rural West often lagging behind the industrial North. Agriculture remained vital, yet farmers faced falling prices, rising debt, and fluctuating markets. Organizations such as the Grange and the Farmers Alliance sought to address these challenges through cooperative purchasing, education, and political advocacy, laying the groundwork for populist movements. Technological improvements, including mechanized plows, harvesters, and irrigation, increased productivity but also transformed labor patterns, contributing to rural depopulation and migration toward urban centers. The interplay between agriculture, industry, and migration reshaped regional identities and economic relationships across the country. Cultural life reflected both the optimism and the contradictions of the Gilded Age. Literature, journalism, and art explored themes of wealth, inequality, morality, and the American dream. Writers such as Mark Twain critiqued social pretension and economic disparity, using satire to highlight the tensions between appearance and reality, while journalists known as muckrakers exposed corruption and injustice in business and politics. Cultural institutions expanded, with museums, theaters, and universities providing spaces for education, reflection, and entertainment, fostering a sense of national identity and civic participation, even amidst rapid transformation. The closing decades of the 19th century also saw the United States expand its influence internationally. Economic growth, technological innovation, and a desire for new markets prompted attention toward foreign trade, diplomacy, and territorial acquisition. The acquisition of Alaska in 1867, purchased from Russia, reflected both strategic foresight and the nation's growing confidence on the world stage. Later, increasing involvement in Pacific and Caribbean affairs laid the foundation for debates about imperialism, national identity, and the role of the United States in global politics, highlighting the intersection of domestic development and international ambition. Social reform movements continued to shape public life. Women's suffrage advocates, temperance organizations, and civil rights activists pressed for greater inclusion, legal equality, and moral responsibility. Educational reform sought to expand access to schooling, improve literacy, and prepare citizens for participation in a rapidly changing society. Public health initiatives, urban planning, and philanthropic efforts aimed to mitigate the effects of industrialization, addressing sanitation, housing, and the welfare of children and workers. These efforts reflected the recognition that progress required not only economic growth, but also social, moral, and civic development. The Gilded Age ultimately left a mixed legacy. Dramatic economic expansion, technological innovation, and social mobility contrasted sharply with deep inequality, political corruption, and the persistence of racial and ethnic discrimination. The successes and failures of the period set the stage for the progressive era of the early 20th century, when reformers would attempt to address the excesses of industrial capitalism, improve labor conditions, and expand democratic participation. The transformation of American society during this era, in both material and social terms, laid the foundation for the modern United States, shaping its economy, culture, and political structures for decades to come. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the United States entered the progressive era, a time of reform, innovation, and social awakening. The dramatic changes brought about by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration had created both opportunity and upheaval, and a new generation of reformers sought to address the challenges of a rapidly transforming society. Corruption in politics, exploitative labor practices, and stark economic inequality demanded attention, and the progressive movement aimed to use government, education, and civic engagement as tools to improve the lives of ordinary citizens while shaping the nation's future. Central to the progressive era was the effort to regulate the excesses of industry and business. Monopolies, trusts, and powerful corporations had consolidated control over key sectors of the economy, limiting competition and exploiting workers and consumers alike. Progressive leaders and reform-minded politicians sought to enact antitrust legislation, promoting fair competition and curbing the concentration of wealth and power. The Sherman Antitrust Act and later regulatory measures targeted abuses in railroads, oil, and other major industries, reflecting a growing belief that government had a role in ensuring economic fairness and protecting public interest, even in a capitalist system. Labor reform continued to be a defining feature of this period. The struggle for fair wages, reasonable working hours, and safe conditions persisted, with unions and labor organizations advocating for the rights of workers. Strikes and demonstrations, often met with resistance or violent suppression, highlighted the ongoing tension between labor and capital. Progressive reformers worked to improve conditions, advocating for child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, and the establishment of minimum wage standards. These efforts reflected a broader societal recognition that industrial prosperity could not come at the expense of human dignity and well-being. Urbanization posed new challenges and opportunities. Cities were crowded, polluted, and often poorly managed, yet they also offered cultural, educational, and economic vitality. Progressive reformers promoted urban planning, public health initiatives, and improved infrastructure to address the social consequences of rapid growth. Sanitation systems were expanded, public transportation networks developed, and parks and recreational spaces created to improve quality of life. Settlement houses such as Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago provided social services, education, and community support, particularly for immigrants and the urban poor, reflecting an ethos of civic responsibility and social improvement. Women's suffrage became a central focus of social reform during this era. Women's organizations, activists, and reformers argued passionately for the right to vote, framing it as both a matter of equality and a means to advance social and moral reform. Grassroots campaigns, marches, lobbying, and civil disobedience gradually built public support, culminating in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which guaranteed women the right to vote nationwide. This milestone not only expanded democratic participation, but also reshaped the political landscape, empowering women to influence policy and social reform at local, state, and national levels. Education reform was another hallmark of the progressive era. Reformers emphasized public schooling as essential to citizenship, social mobility, and economic development. Schools expanded access, standardized curricula, and introduced vocational training to prepare students for the demands of industrial and urban life. Higher education institutions grew in both size and influence, promoting research, professional training, and civic engagement. Literacy, critical thinking, and civic awareness became central to the progressive vision of a well-functioning democracy, linking education to the broader goals of social improvement and national progress. Social justice issues extended beyond labor and education. Efforts to address poverty, public health, and social inequality were increasingly institutionalized. Reformers promoted campaigns against alcohol through the temperance movement, sought to improve housing conditions, and advocated for welfare programs to support vulnerable populations. The passage of prohibition in 1919, while controversial, reflected the era's commitment to moral and social reform, illustrating the belief that government and civic action could shape society in accordance with ethical principles and collective well-being. Internationally, the United States began to assert itself as a global power. Economic growth, technological advancement, and political stability positioned the nation to engage more actively in world affairs. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a significant moment, resulting in the acquisition of territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while establishing the United States as an influential player in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. These actions reflected a combination of strategic ambition, economic interests, and a growing belief in the nation's responsibility on the global stage, laying the groundwork for expanded involvement in international diplomacy and conflict. The progressive era also saw the development of modern regulatory institutions. Agencies such as the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Food and Drug Administration were empowered to oversee industry, ensure safety, and enforce standards. Scientific management, data collection, and policy analysis became central to governance, reflecting a commitment to rational and evidence-based approaches to social and economic challenges. These innovations reshaped the relationship between government, business, and citizens, establishing principles of oversight and accountability that would influence policy well into the 20th century. Culturally, the era was marked by literary, artistic, and intellectual dynamism. Writers, journalists, and thinkers explored themes of social inequality, urban life, and the moral implications of industrialization. Muckraking journalists exposed corruption and corporate malfeasance, shaping public opinion and catalyzing reform. At the same time, artistic movements and cultural institutions reflected both the optimism and the tensions of the age, blending traditional values with modern sensibilities and creating a rich and evolving American cultural landscape. Technological innovation continued to transform daily life. The widespread adoption of electricity, the telephone, and the automobile reshaped urban planning, communication, and personal mobility. Innovations in medicine, public health, and agriculture improved standards of living, while scientific advancements enabled new approaches to industry and commerce. The pace of change fostered optimism, opportunity, and anxiety in equal measure, as Americans adjusted to a world in which technology increasingly mediated work, leisure, and social interaction. Political reform during the Progressive Era extended to government structures themselves. Efforts to reduce corruption, increase transparency, and enhance citizen participation included the introduction of primary elections, the initiative, referendum, and recall processes, and reforms at local, state, and federal levels. These measures reflected a commitment to making government more responsive to the public, curbing the influence of entrenched interests, and ensuring that democratic ideals translated into practical governance. Despite progress, challenges remained. Racial inequality, particularly in the South, persisted through segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic discrimination. Native American communities faced continued displacement and assimilation policies, while labor and immigrant communities struggled for recognition and fair treatment. The nation grappled with the tension between its ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy, and the realities of entrenched social hierarchies, prejudice, and regional disparities. Reformers, politicians, and ordinary citizens navigated this complex landscape, striving to reconcile aspirations with structural and cultural limitations. By the early 20th century, the United States had transformed significantly. Industrial and urban growth, social reform, women's enfranchisement, and international engagement had reshaped society and governance. Yet the nation remained dynamic and contested, with ongoing debates over labor, race, economic inequality, and the role of government reflecting the continuing evolution of American identity. The Progressive Era laid the groundwork for modern institutions, social policies, and cultural norms, establishing patterns of reform, activism, and governance that would guide the country into the turbulent decades of the 20th century. The early decades of the 20th century brought dramatic shifts to the United States, both at home and abroad. With the nation fully industrialized and socially transformed by the Progressive Era, it faced new opportunities and challenges on the global stage. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 initially drew the United States into a position of cautious neutrality, observing the conflict across the Atlantic, while maintaining trade and diplomatic relations. However, as the war progressed, events such as unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram drew the nation inexorably into the conflict. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, marking its first significant military engagement on European soil and signaling the emergence of the nation as a global power. The U.S. mobilization for World War I was unprecedented. Millions of young men enlisted or were drafted into military service, while industry shifted to meet the demands of modern warfare. Factories produced arms, vehicles, and supplies at an extraordinary pace, and the government coordinated efforts to ensure efficiency and support for the troops. Innovations in communication, transportation, and logistics played crucial roles in sustaining the war effort. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, filling roles previously dominated by men and demonstrating their capabilities beyond traditional domestic spheres. The war catalyzed social and economic change, redefining gender roles and labor expectations across the nation. American troops, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, arrived in Europe in 1918, providing much-needed reinforcement to the weary Allied forces. The presence of U.S. soldiers, combined with fresh supplies and coordinated strategies, contributed to the eventual defeat of the Central Powers. The war ended with the signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, leaving a transformed Europe and a United States poised for an expanded role in global diplomacy. President Woodrow Wilson's vision, articulated in his 14 points, sought to promote peace, self-determination, and the establishment of the League of Nations, although domestic opposition ultimately limited the United States' participation in the new international organization. The post-war period, known as the Roaring Twenties, was characterized by economic prosperity, cultural dynamism, and social experimentation. Industrial production and consumer goods industries expanded rapidly, fueling widespread optimism and material growth. Automobiles, radios, and household appliances transformed daily life, making mobility, communication, and convenience more accessible than ever. Cities became vibrant centers of entertainment, culture, and nightlife, with jazz music, dance halls, and cinema reflecting a society eager to embrace modernity and leisure. The period was defined by a sense of possibility, technological advancement, and an eagerness to explore new cultural and social frontiers. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity lay significant tensions and contradictions. Prohibition, enacted through the 18th Amendment in 1920, banned the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol, sparking widespread resistance, illicit trade, and organized crime. The law, intended to promote moral reform and social stability, instead fueled corruption and public defiance, revealing the complexities of legislating morality in a rapidly changing society. Cultural conflicts emerged between traditionalists, often rooted in rural areas, and modernists, primarily in urban centers, reflecting broader debates over values, identity, and the pace of social change. Immigration continued to shape the cultural landscape, even as new legislation sought to restrict the flow of newcomers. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 established limits based on national origins, reflecting anxieties about cultural change, labor competition, and national identity. These laws favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, while limiting those from Southern and Eastern Europe, and virtually excluding Asians. The policies reshaped demographic patterns and fueled debates about citizenship, belonging, and the evolving definition of what it meant to be American in a diverse society. Economic prosperity during the 1920s, while significant, was uneven and built on fragile foundations. Agricultural sectors struggled with falling prices, overproduction, and debt, while speculation and unregulated investment in stock markets fueled wealth in urban centers. The disparity between rural and urban experiences highlighted the uneven distribution of opportunity, revealing vulnerabilities in the economic system. Banks, industry, and consumers often engaged in speculative practices without safeguards, setting the stage for a financial collapse that would profoundly affect millions and reshape government policy in the years to come. Culturally, the 1920s were an era of bold experimentation and expression. The Harlem Renaissance, centered in New York City, celebrated African American culture, literature, music, and art, challenging prevailing stereotypes and asserting the creativity and resilience of Black communities. Writers, poets, and artists explored new forms, themes, and perspectives, influencing national consciousness and contributing to broader conversations about race, identity, and equality. At the same time, mass media, including newspapers, radio, and cinema, created a shared cultural experience, spreading ideas, trends, and entertainment to an ever-expanding audience. The era also saw significant advances in science, medicine, and technology. Medical breakthroughs, including the discovery of insulin and vaccines for diseases such as diphtheria, improved public health outcomes. Innovations in aviation, exemplified by Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight, captured the imagination of the public and demonstrated the potential of human ingenuity. These achievements symbolized progress, confidence, and a belief in the capacity of science and technology to transform society, shaping the mindset of a generation eager to embrace modernity. Despite the apparent prosperity and cultural vibrancy, underlying vulnerabilities culminated in the stock market crash of 1929, marking the beginning of the Great Depression. The collapse of financial markets, combined with bank failures, widespread unemployment, and the contraction of industrial production, created a profound economic crisis. Millions of Americans faced poverty, hunger, and uncertainty, while families and communities struggled to maintain stability. The Depression exposed the limitations of existing economic systems and the absence of social safety nets, prompting calls for transformative government intervention and the development of policies aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. The response to the Great Depression reshaped the role of the federal government in American life. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal introduced a series of programs and reforms designed to stabilize the economy, provide employment, and protect vulnerable populations. Initiatives such as Social Security, unemployment insurance, public works projects, and financial regulations addressed both immediate needs and long-term structural challenges. The New Deal fundamentally transformed the relationship between citizens and government, establishing the expectation that the state would play an active role in ensuring economic security, social welfare, and the regulation of markets. Social and cultural life during the Depression reflected resilience, creativity, and adaptation. Art, literature, and film often depicted the struggles of ordinary people, while government-sponsored programs supported the arts and documentation of American life. Communities developed informal support networks, mutual aid societies, and local initiatives to provide assistance, reflecting the enduring capacity for collective action in times of crisis. The period tested the nation's values, adaptability, and solidarity, highlighting both vulnerability and the potential for recovery through coordinated effort and innovative policy. The late 1920s and 1930s also saw shifts in foreign policy and international engagement. The United States initially maintained a stance of relative isolation, focused on domestic recovery, yet global events, including the rise of totalitarian regimes and economic instability abroad, created pressures for increased involvement in world affairs. Debates over intervention, neutrality, and international responsibility reflected ongoing tensions between national priorities and emerging global challenges, foreshadowing the complex decisions the country would face in the decades to come. As the world edged closer to another global conflict in the late 1930s, the United States found itself navigating the complexities of international tension while continuing to recover from the hardships of the Great Depression. The rise of aggressive totalitarian regimes in Europe and Asia, particularly Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and Imperial Japan, posed unprecedented threats to peace and stability. Initially, the United States pursued a policy of neutrality, reflecting a desire to focus on domestic recovery and avoid the devastation of another world war. However, the growing threat to global stability, combined with economic and strategic considerations, gradually drew the nation toward active involvement in international affairs. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, marked a turning point, thrusting the United States fully into World War II. The surprise assault by Japanese forces on the US naval base in Hawaii resulted in significant loss of life and naval power, galvanizing public opinion and prompting an immediate declaration of war. The nation mobilized rapidly, converting factories, infrastructure, and human resources into a wartime economy. Millions of men and women joined the military or contributed to war production, creating a sense of shared purpose and national unity as the country confronted a global threat. The American home front during World War II was a testament to adaptability, innovation, and collective effort. Industry shifted from peacetime production to the manufacture of military equipment, vehicles, aircraft, and munitions, transforming the economy and creating jobs. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, challenging traditional gender roles and reshaping perceptions of women's capabilities in society. Rationing, conservation, and volunteer efforts became part of daily life, instilling a culture of shared sacrifice and civic responsibility. Communities across the nation rallied to support troops abroad and maintain social cohesion, demonstrating the resilience and resourcefulness of American society under pressure. On the battlefield, American forces participated in both the European and Pacific theaters, playing pivotal roles in the defeat of Axis powers. In Europe, US troops, alongside Allied forces, engaged in campaigns across North Africa, Italy, and ultimately France, following the D-Day invasion of Normandy in 1944. The liberation of occupied territories, intense combat, and the strategic coordination of multiple nations showcased both military ingenuity and the immense human cost of warfare. In the Pacific, US forces faced formidable challenges in island-hopping campaigns against Japanese strongholds, employing strategy, naval power, and technological innovation to secure victory. The war demanded extraordinary resilience, skill, and sacrifice from soldiers and civilians alike, leaving an indelible mark on national identity and global influence. Technological and scientific advancements played a critical role in shaping the course of the war. Developments in radar, cryptography, aircraft design, and medicine enhanced military effectiveness and operational coordination. The Manhattan Project, a top-secret research initiative, ultimately led to the creation of the atomic bomb, a revolutionary and controversial weapon that would decisively end the war in the Pacific. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought Japan to surrender, demonstrating the unprecedented destructive power of nuclear technology and reshaping global military strategy, diplomacy, and ethical considerations for generations to come. World War II also had profound social and economic effects on American society. The mobilization of the workforce, combined with rationing and government-directed production, ended the lingering unemployment of the Depression era and accelerated economic growth. African Americans, Latinos, and other minority groups sought to assert civil rights and expand opportunities, contributing to the war effort while challenging existing social hierarchies. Programs such as the Double V campaign, which emphasized victory against fascism abroad and racial discrimination at home, highlighted the intertwined nature of global and domestic struggles for justice and equality. The war effort required coordination at unprecedented levels, fostering innovation in management, logistics, and governance. Federal agencies expanded their reach to oversee production, distribution, and labor relations, demonstrating the capacity of centralized planning to achieve large-scale objectives. Partnerships between government, private industry, and scientific institutions created a model of collaboration that would influence post-war policy and economic development. The experiences of wartime mobilization, coupled with social and technological advancements, laid the foundation for the United States' post-war prosperity and its emergence as a global leader. Culturally, the war years were marked by both hardship and resilience. Propaganda, entertainment, and media shaped public perception, morale, and national identity. Films, radio programs, and newspapers emphasized unity, duty, and sacrifice, creating a shared narrative of collective struggle and purpose. Meanwhile, families and communities adapted to disruptions, rationing, and the absence of loved ones, developing new social norms and networks of support. The shared experiences of wartime life fostered a sense of national cohesion while highlighting the profound human costs of global conflict. As the war drew to a close, the United States emerged not only victorious, but transformed. The nation had demonstrated remarkable military and industrial capabilities, technological ingenuity, and societal resilience. The experiences of mobilization, combat, and home front adaptation positioned the United States to assume a leadership role in the post-war world, shaping global institutions, economic systems, and diplomatic norms. The lessons of unity, innovation, and adaptability forged during these years would continue to influence American policy, culture, and identity in the decades that followed. The conclusion of World War II also initiated the beginning of the Cold War, a new era of geopolitical tension and competition with the Soviet Union. While the United States helped to establish the United Nations and promote international cooperation, ideological differences, military rivalries, and competing visions of governance created a prolonged period of political, economic, and military rivalry. The post-war era was thus both a moment of triumph and the start of a new set of challenges, as the nation navigated its role as a superpower in a rapidly changing world. Domestically, the post-war years brought economic prosperity, suburban growth, and demographic shifts. Returning veterans utilized programs such as the GI Bill to pursue education, purchase homes, and build careers, contributing to a thriving middle class and the expansion of consumer culture. Suburban communities grew, infrastructure expanded, and technological innovations continued to reshape daily life, from household appliances to transportation networks. These developments reflected both the benefits of post-war stability and the challenges of managing growth, inequality, and social change in a dynamic society. Social movements and civil rights struggles gained momentum in the post-war era. African Americans, inspired by wartime service and global ideals of freedom and justice, increasingly challenged segregation and discrimination, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Women, who had contributed significantly to the workforce during the war, sought to maintain professional opportunities and assert independence, reshaping gender norms and expectations. Minority communities, including Native Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, also pursued greater recognition, rights, and opportunities, reflecting a broader re-examination of social justice and equality in a changing nation. Internationally, the United States played a leading role in establishing new political and economic frameworks. The Marshall Plan aided in the reconstruction of Europe. NATO established collective security, and economic policies promoted global trade and stability. The nation's leadership in international institutions, combined with its military and economic strength, positioned the United States as a central actor in shaping the post-war order, balancing national interests with the promotion of democratic values, economic development, and collective security. The decades following World War II were marked by profound transformation, as the United States navigated its role as a global superpower while confronting deep domestic challenges. The Cold War dominated international relations, shaping military, political, and economic policy for nearly half a century. Tension with the Soviet Union manifested in nuclear arms competition, ideological rivalry, and a series of proxy wars across the globe. The threat of mutually assured destruction underscored the stakes of the conflict, while the space race demonstrated both scientific ambition and national pride. From the launch of Sputnik to the Apollo moon landing, technological achievements became symbols of global competition and national identity, capturing the imagination of the public and reinforcing the sense of America as a leading innovator. Domestically, the post-war years brought economic prosperity, suburban expansion, and the rise of consumer culture. Returning veterans, empowered by the GI Bill, purchased homes, attended college, and established careers, contributing to the growth of a thriving middle class. Suburbs spread across the landscape, facilitated by automobile ownership, highway construction, and affordable housing programs, reshaping social and geographic patterns. Shopping centers, television, and mass media played key roles in creating shared cultural experiences, while advertising and consumer goods defined lifestyles and social aspirations. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, inequalities persisted, particularly along lines of race, gender, and class. The struggle for civil rights became a defining feature of mid-20th century America. African Americans, long subjected to segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic discrimination, mounted organized efforts to secure legal equality and social justice. Landmark events and figures, including the Montgomery bus boycott led by Rosa Parks, the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., and the legislative achievements of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, challenged entrenched systems of oppression. Activism extended beyond legal reform, influencing culture, education, and community organization, while highlighting the tension between American ideals of freedom and the realities of racial injustice. The broader struggle for equality encompassed women's rights, Latino activism, Native American advocacy, and other movements seeking social recognition and equity. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s challenged traditional gender roles, demanding equal opportunities in education, employment, and political participation. Organizations and leaders worked to dismantle legal and social barriers, reshaping public discourse and influencing policy. Similarly, Latino and Native American communities pursued greater representation, cultural preservation, and civil rights, reflecting a national awakening to the need for inclusion and justice across diverse populations. Internationally, the United States faced a series of conflicts and interventions that shaped both foreign policy and domestic attitudes. The Korean War of the early 1950s tested the nation's commitment to containing communism, while the Vietnam War of the 1960s and early 1970s became a deeply polarizing experience. Vietnam, in particular, exposed tensions between political idealism, military strategy, and public opinion, resulting in widespread protest, cultural upheaval, and reassessment of foreign policy. These conflicts demonstrated the complexities of Cold War engagement and the challenges of projecting power while maintaining domestic consensus and ethical legitimacy. The post-war era was also a time of cultural revolution and social experimentation. Music, literature, film, and art reflected shifting values, generational tensions, and new forms of expression. The Beat generation challenged conformity and traditional morality, while rock and roll and youth culture symbolized both rebellion and a broader embrace of modernity. Television, radio, and cinema became central in shaping public consciousness, creating shared narratives and cultural touchstones. Educational expansion, scientific advancement, and urban development further transformed society, blending tradition and innovation in ways that redefined what it meant to be American. Economically, the mid-20th century was marked by growth, technological innovation, and the expansion of government programs. The post-war boom created new opportunities, yet also prompted debates over taxation, regulation, and the role of federal intervention. Programs in health, education, and infrastructure sought to balance prosperity with social equity, while the rise of multinational corporations and technological industries reshaped labor markets and regional economies. Innovations in computing, aerospace, and communications laid the foundation for a new era of productivity and connectivity, positioning the United States as a leader in science and technology on the global stage. Social movements of this era highlighted both the potential and limitations of progress. Despite legislative gains and cultural shifts, systemic inequalities persisted, sparking ongoing activism and advocacy. Environmental concerns, labor rights, and economic justice emerged as important themes, reflecting a growing awareness of the interconnectedness of society, economy, and ecology. Grassroots movements, advocacy organizations, and individual leaders contributed to a dynamic and often contentious national dialogue, emphasizing the active role of citizens in shaping the future of the nation. The late 20th century also witnessed significant political developments. The presidency, Congress, and judiciary navigated complex issues related to domestic reform, international engagement, and economic policy. Civil liberties, social welfare, taxation, and foreign relations were continuously debated, reflecting the diverse priorities and values of a changing population. Political polarization, while not as pronounced as in later decades, emerged as a feature of national discourse, shaping policy decisions and influencing public perception of governance. By the end of the 20th century, the United States had experienced profound transformations. From a post-war industrial and technological powerhouse to a culturally diverse, globally influential society. The civil rights movement, economic expansion, technological innovation, and international engagement redefined both domestic life and the nation's role in the world. Americans faced both opportunities and challenges in reconciling ideals with reality, managing diversity, and sustaining prosperity. The lessons of these decades underscored the importance of adaptability, civic engagement, and forward-looking policies in maintaining national cohesion and progress. Culturally, the United States became a hub of creativity, media, and influence, with its music, film, literature, and visual arts reaching global audiences. Popular culture, technological innovation, and educational expansion created new pathways for expression, identity, and opportunity. At the same time, social and political debates reflected ongoing struggles over equality, justice, and inclusion, highlighting the tension between national ideals and social realities. These dynamics set the stage for the 21st century, as the nation continued to balance growth, diversity, and global responsibility in an increasingly interconnected world. As the 20th century closed and the 21st began, the United States entered a period of rapid technological, social, and political transformation. The rise of the digital age revolutionized communication, commerce, and daily life, connecting people across continents in ways previously unimaginable. Computers, the internet, and mobile technology reshaped work, education, and entertainment, creating a society increasingly dependent on information, innovation, and connectivity. Social media platforms emerged as powerful tools for expression, activism, and engagement, allowing voices from all walks of life to influence culture, politics, and public discourse. Globalization accelerated economic, cultural, and political interdependence. Trade agreements, multinational corporations, and international financial systems linked the American economy with those of nations worldwide, creating opportunities for growth but also exposure to global instability. Outsourcing, technological disruption, and shifts in manufacturing transformed traditional industries, while new sectors in technology, finance, and services flourished. Americans navigated these changes with a mix of optimism and uncertainty, as rapid innovation offered unprecedented possibilities while challenging established social, economic, and cultural norms. The early 21st century also brought new security concerns. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, profoundly affected the nation, reshaping foreign and domestic policy, security measures, and the collective consciousness. The United States launched military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, while enhancing intelligence, emergency response, and counter-terrorism capabilities at home. These events highlighted the complex interplay between national security, civil liberties, and global engagement, emphasizing the challenges of maintaining safety and democracy in a rapidly changing and interconnected world. Economically, the nation faced cycles of growth and recession. The financial crisis of 2008 exposed vulnerabilities in the global banking system, mortgage markets, and regulatory frameworks, leading to widespread economic hardship and necessitating unprecedented government intervention. Recovery efforts, policy reforms, and technological innovation gradually restored stability and growth. Yet the events underscored the importance of oversight, resilience, and adaptability in managing complex economies. Meanwhile, new industries in technology, renewable energy, and healthcare offered pathways for expansion and modernization, reshaping labor markets and regional economies. Socially, the United States continued to wrestle with issues of equity, inclusion, and representation. The ongoing struggle for racial justice, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and immigrant inclusion reflected the persistent need to align national ideals with lived realities. Grassroots movements, advocacy organizations, and digital activism provided new avenues for engagement and change, while debates over policy, identity, and social norms highlighted the dynamic nature of American democracy. The nation's diversity, while a source of strength and creativity, also required careful negotiation of differing values, experiences, and aspirations. Culturally, the United States became a hub of global influence. Film, music, literature, and digital media reached international audiences, shaping perceptions, trends, and social movements worldwide. Artistic expression, storytelling, and innovation reflected both historical roots and contemporary experiences, blending tradition and modernity in ways that resonated across generations. Education, research, and technological development continued to expand, fostering creativity, critical thinking, and global collaboration. Americans increasingly participated in a shared global culture while retaining distinct national identities and traditions. Technological advancement transformed nearly every aspect of life. Smartphones, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and renewable energy systems reshaped work, healthcare, communication, and environmental management. Cities evolved with smart infrastructure, transportation innovations, and digital connectivity, while rural areas adapted to changing economic patterns and technological access. The rapid pace of innovation demanded flexibility, lifelong learning, and ethical consideration, as individuals and institutions grappled with the benefits and challenges of an increasingly complex and automated world. Environmental awareness and sustainability emerged as central concerns. Climate change, resource management, and ecological preservation prompted initiatives at local, state, and federal levels, reflecting a growing recognition of the interconnectedness of human activity and natural systems. Policy measures, scientific research, and community engagement sought to balance development with conservation, aiming to protect ecosystems, reduce emissions, and promote resilience in the face of environmental challenges. Public awareness and activism amplified these efforts, underscoring the shared responsibility of citizens, government, and businesses in shaping a sustainable future. Politically, the United States experienced both continuity and change. Partisan polarization intensified debates over governance, social policy, and economic priorities, challenging institutions to navigate complex societal demands. Electoral processes, civic engagement, and media influence shaped public perception and participation, reflecting the evolving nature of democracy in the digital age. At the same time, federal, state, and local governments continued to address infrastructure, healthcare, education, and public safety, balancing immediate needs with long-term planning and innovation. Internationally, the United States maintained a position of global leadership while confronting new challenges. Diplomacy, trade, military presence, and cultural influence were exercised amid a multipolar world with rising powers, transnational threats, and shifting alliances. Issues such as cybersecurity, climate cooperation, and international trade policy highlighted the complexity of modern global engagement, requiring strategic foresight, collaboration, and adaptability. The nation's capacity to navigate these dynamics shaped both domestic prosperity and international stability, reinforcing its role as a pivotal actor on the world stage. The social fabric of the 21st century United States reflects resilience, creativity, and ongoing transformation. Communities engage in dialogue over identity, justice, and opportunity, while education, technology, and culture provide pathways for innovation and progress. Civic activism, volunteerism, and public participation demonstrate enduring commitment to democratic principles, even amid uncertainty and change. Americans continue to negotiate the balance between tradition and innovation, local and global priorities, and individual freedom and collective responsibility, shaping a dynamic society responsive to both historical lessons and contemporary challenges. In summary, the history of America is a story of transformation, resilience, and evolution. From ancient indigenous cultures to European colonization, revolutionary independence, industrialization, social reform, global conflicts, civil rights struggles, and modern technological and cultural innovations, the nation has continually adapted to challenges and opportunities. Its journey reflects a complex interplay of ideas, actions, and consequences, shaped by individuals, communities, and institutions. Today, the United States stands as a nation defined by diversity, innovation, and global influence, carrying forward the legacy of its past while navigating the opportunities and responsibilities of the present and future.